The night lay heavy upon the battlements of Winterfell as a thin moon arced across the dark sky, offering scant light to see by. Torches glowed in their sconces along the stone walls, and the cold bit harder than usual, cutting through layers of cloak and wool to nip at any exposed skin. The North had always been a land of harsh winters and even harsher truths, and on this night, truth was about to wound hearts as surely as the ice-laced wind cut through the armor of vigilant guards. Jon Snow stood on one of the highest parapets, looking down into the courtyard where the stables, the smithy, and the great hall of Winterfell spread out in the blackness. Despite the walls encircling him, he felt no safer here than atop the wall where he'd once kept watch. He thought of Castle Black, what seemed like a lifetime ago, even though not many moons had passed since he'd left the Night's Watch. His duty had once been clear. He was a sworn brother of the Watch, and there was honor in those black robes. But fate had a way of drawing new lines across old vows, and the swirl of events had forced him to abandon oaths once believed unbreakable. Those decisions had reverberated throughout the North, setting in motion forces that neither he nor anyone else could halt. Ghost padded silently at his side, the direwolf's red eyes gleaming whenever the torchlight touched them. He was a sentinel in the darkness, unwavering, faithful only to Jon, unaware of the brewing storm that threatened to topple the entire foundation of the North. Ghost sensed Jon's tension though, matching step for step, never straying more than a few feet away. Jon had arrived at Winterfell under the most unexpected circumstances, carrying messages from the wall intended for Robb Stark. But the moment he crossed into the courtyard, men began to murmur, and women whispered behind their hands. The bastard son of Ned Stark was returning, and something in his bearing, in the tightness of his mouth or the solemn cast of his eyes, seemed changed. Though he'd been no more than a child when last he'd left with his uncle Ben-Jen for the Night's Watch, those memories still lingered in the hearts of serving maids and stable boys who recognized him. Whispers grew to rumors, and rumors flared into new shapes. Some spoke of Jon Snow as the rightful son of Eddard Stark, whispering that the rumor of his parentage was not as they'd long believed, that his father was not a dishonorable man after all, or that Jon had royal blood in his veins. Others simply saw him as a threat to the line of the young Lord Robb, who had taken up arms to defend his father's name and the North's independence after Ned Stark had been called a traitor by King Joffrey. But as the news spread of Ned Stark's imprisonment in King's Landing and the chaos engulfing the Seven Kingdoms, lords and ladies alike turned suspicious gazes upon each other, wondering which side they should trust. That was when it happened, seemingly out of nowhere, though in truth it had been building all along. A faction of northern lords, mainly those living closer to the wall or in remote holdfasts, began to wonder if perhaps they should follow Jon Snow. He was, after all, of Ned Stark's blood, if the late lord's honor was to be believed. And with Robb Stark marching south with a large portion of the North's strength, Winterfell itself had been left somewhat vulnerable. The seat of power in the North was still here, in these ancient halls. But if the lords who remained behind decided that Jon was the safer choice, one unconstrained by a southbound war, then there would be a contested right to Winterfell's rule. The direwolf still flew proudly on both men's banners, but to have two rival claimants, Robb, the trueborn eldest son, and Jon, the once bastard who had gained too much popularity among certain bannermen, was a recipe for conflict that threatened to tear the North apart. That conflict, Jon reflected, was not something he ever craved. Yet it pressed upon him from all sides like an ever-tightening noose. Rumor, rumor, rumor. He had thought the crows' caws upon the wall incessant, but they were nothing compared to the swirl of voices in Winterfell now. Men came to him in corners of the yard, kneeling and pledging loyalty. Others spat at his feet, calling him oathbreaker for deserting the Watch and a traitor for raising a hand against his own brother's birthright. He tried to refuse them, to send them all away, but the tides of war had little respect for wishes, and once the notion of Jon Snow as a rallying point took hold, it grew like weeds. He couldn't help but recall the last words of Maester Aemon Targaryen before he left Castle Black. "A Targaryen alone in the world is a terrible thing," the old man had said softly, but at the time, Jon had not known Aemon spoke of him in any sense. Only later did fragments of the secret filter through. His father Ned Stark's refusal to speak of Jon's mother, the perplexing looks from certain men who knew more of the old wars than they let on. Rumors carried up to the wall, even from the far south, whispering in coded words of Rhaegar Targaryen's child. And so, piece by piece, the truth began to take shape. It was no longer a secret that some men whispered, some men believed, that Jon was the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark. He had no proof, nothing that would stand in a court of lords or a sept's holy judgment. But men loved a stirring tale, and in the chaos that followed King Robert's death, improbable truths and illusions found purchase like never before. So it was that many lords saw in Jon Snow a potential alternative. Perhaps it was not just about the blood of Ned Stark, but about the possibility of uniting North and South under a Targaryen banner, about retribution against House Lannister, or about forging alliances anew. Jon had tried to quell it at first, tried to speak only of supporting his brother Robb, the rightful Lord of Winterfell, Warden of the North. But with every passing day, he saw the pressure on Winterfell mount. The castle needed a firm hand in these dire times, and many believed that the next best hand, indeed, for some an even better hand, was Jon's. He was unprepared for the momentum. The day he returned, Maester Luwin, the kind-eyed old counselor who had taught him and Robb and the rest of the Stark children their letters and histories, quietly requested a word. They had gone together up the winding steps of the library tower. Gray gloom stretched across the sky outside narrow windows, leaving them both half in shadow. Maester Luwin had explained calmly, in precise terms, that the North could not abide confusion for long. With Robb away, the lords who remained needed a figure of authority. For many reasons, Jon Stark blood, the crisis gripping the realm, rumors of his potential Targaryen heritage, there were two distinct factions forming. And with Ned Stark's captivity in King's Landing uncertain, the longer this dragged on, the more likely that it would devolve into bloodshed. "I have no wish to usurp my brother," Jon had told the Maester, voice tense. "Yet you do?" Maester Luwin said softly, showing more sorrow than judgment. "Intentionally or not, simply by existing and returning now, you have created a choice for people who otherwise had none." Jon remembered the taste of dread in his mouth, far sharper than the crisp air on the battlements. He watched the flicker of a torch in the courtyard below. He had tried ignoring it, tried refusing it, but the push was relentless. Men said the North needed him. That was the final chord that struck his heart. The North needed him. Duty. He had once sworn another duty, but that path had long since crumbled beneath the avalanche of revelations. So here he was, a swirl of loyal men around him, pressed to claim the seat of Winterfell. Quiet footsteps echoed across the cold stones behind him. He turned to see that it was Lady Barbary Dustin of Barrowton, her fur-lined cloak draped over slender shoulders. A proud woman with keen gray eyes, she was rumored to despise the Starks, but she had a complicated history with House Stark that few understood fully. She had arrived in Winterfell days prior, strangely enough, to offer her counsel. And counsel she did offer, most of which urged Jon to stand firm. "I can guess what you're thinking," she said softly, approaching him. The wind tugged her cloak around her frame. "And I suspect you already know that if you continue to waver, you will only invite more uncertainty. This fracturing is not a temporary matter that can be hidden beneath a rug." He turned his eyes away. The shadows cast by a single torch behind her flicked across the ramparts, giving her an elongated, spectral silhouette. "I never wanted this, my lady," he said, voice taut. "I only wanted to serve my brother, to help free our father, and defend the North." She came to stand beside him, her chin lifted, as though surveying the battlements below. "Jon Snow or Jon Stark if you prefer," she said gently. "Sometimes the greatest leaders are those who never asked for the role. It is precisely your reluctance that convinces many you are the more honorable choice." He frowned. "This is madness. Robb is the trueborn heir to Winterfell. He is the one the North should rally behind." "And many do," Lady Dustin replied, "but not all, and so we are at an impasse." Ghost, sensing Jon's unease, let out a faint whine. Lady Dustin studied the direwolf for a moment, something unreadable in her eyes. She then turned to leave, offering only parting words. Winterfell needs a strong hand now, Jon Snow, and I hope you find the resolve to grasp it. Our time is short. Stark or Targaryen, the choice will be yours. Sooner than you think." She left him to the night. He stood there for a long while, uncertain which stars overhead might guide him forward. There was no easy path between the vow he owed Robb and the vow he felt to the north. The next day at dawn he made his claim. Some would later say it was the stonemasons who turned the tide. Others said it was the stable hands, the blacksmiths, the huntsmen. A handful of men, humble folk who had once known Jon Snow as the quiet bastard of Ned Stark, spurred the first wave of support. They insisted he was chosen by the old gods, marked by his dire wolf, a sign from the ancient days of the first men. So they knelt, just outside the great hall, and pledged themselves to him. Their kneeling caught the attention of some lesser lordlings milling about the yard, men who had come to Winterfell for guidance and found no one but a young, untested steward acting in Robb's name. They saw this small gathering and hesitated. The next day more joined, and the day after still more. Jon tried to push them away, but they pressed so earnestly, so desperately, that soon a small crowd knelt in the muddy yard. He found himself addressing them, uncertain how to shape the words, even more uncertain how to quell their hopes. If he told them to swear fealty to Robb, they refused, saying that it was Jon who stood here now, leading them in their time of need. If he told them to wait for Robb's return, they balked, insisting there was no time to wait while word spread that King Joffrey might put Ned Stark to death. One of the stable hands cried out that the Lannisters would come for Winterfell next. Another shouted that the Bolton men would seize the seat if no strong leader presented himself. Chaos threatened to fracture all but the sturdiest loyalties. And in that chaos something shifted. Jon realized, to his horror, that the lords and ladies who had once looked past him as the bastard in the corner were studying him with renewed interest. They saw strength in him, perhaps the echo of Ned Stark's iron will. They saw in him a kind of reluctant determination that made them believe he would not lead the North astray. And though Jon's own heart thundered with uncertainty, he saw that he could either step forward or watch the North descend into confusion, possibly allowing other powers, Roose Bolton, maybe even the Ironborn, to seize the advantage in the vacuum of authority. So he claimed Winterfell, provisionally, in a quiet, somber ceremony before the weirwood tree in the Godswood. Fewer than 20 men stood to witness it, but that was all that was needed. There beneath the red leaves and white bark, in the dappled morning light, he vowed to protect the North and serve the realm's best interests. He did not proclaim himself king in the North, nor did he proclaim himself a Targaryen. He merely said, in a subdued voice that nearly trembled, "I am Jon Snow, of the blood of Eddard Stark, and until my brother Robb's return, I shall protect and guide the North as best as I can." It was enough for them. They cheered, some even wept, and the sound echoed amid the heart tree's ancient branches. The old gods bore witness, silent and unmoving. As Jon Snow rose from the forest floor, Ghost stood at his side, muzzle lifted, eyes watchful. News travels quickly when tongues are eager. Within days, the knowledge spread to holdfasts across the North. Winterfell had a new protector. The new Warden, some called him, though that was a title the crown bestowed. Robb had been named Warden of the North by King Robert's decree. Others whispered that Jon Snow had usurped his brother's seat, that he was a traitor to the rightful lord. But in a region as large and spread out as the North, scattered lords clung to the rumor they preferred. Some, fearful of losing the seat of Stark power to chaos, recognized Jon Snow as the caretaker. Others refused him, calling his claim an insult to Robb's rightful place. And thus the lines were drawn. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Raven after raven arrived from various houses. Some messages were cordial, acknowledging Jon's presence and requesting negotiations. Others were blunt, demanding he step aside before blood was spilled. Some were from outraged lords who had already sworn fealty to Robb and refused to break that oath. But a surprisingly large portion were from lords who were uncertain, waiting to see if Robb would return or if Jon would prove the safer bet. In those messages, Jon read hesitation, fear, and a desire to be on the winning side. Meanwhile, the North's immediate problems multiplied. Roose Bolton had begun to fortify the Dreadfort, sending out roving bands to gather taxes from smaller villages that had sworn no direct loyalty to the Boltons in recent years, employing cruelty to force them into submission. Lord Serwin's death from a fever left his young son in tenuous control of Castle Serwin. Outlaws roamed the unsettled borderlands, taking advantage of the chaos to raid. Rumor spoke of the Ironborn stirring in the west, sending longships to test the coastline near Torrhen Square. Winterfell needed a plan, multiple plans, if it was to endure. Jon found himself embroiled in council after council, scribes and stewards pressing him for decisions, something he had never imagined for his life. He recalled training with a sword in the yard or wearing black at Castle Black. Those days seemed as simple as children's games compared to this swirl of politics. Yet he did not flinch, for if there was one thing he had learned from Ned Stark, it was that leadership demanded duty above all else. Maester Luwin provided calm guidance, reminding him of the allegiances each house held, the likely outcomes of certain decisions, and the need to maintain supplies in the face of winter. Lady Dustin hovered frequently, offering pointed remarks that prodded Jon to be bolder, to hold no illusions about the loyalty of some houses. Others, like the Mormonts from Bear Island, were split. Meege Mormont had marched south with Robb, leaving behind uncertain loyalties. The Glover men of Deepwood Mott had also ridden south, but the castle steward seemed open to sending supplies if Jon requested them. All of this made Jon's head spin. Still, his quiet determination, his intangible sense of Stark honor, kept many from outright rebellion against him. He seemed willing to share power, at least for the moment, though men whispered about what would happen if Robb returned with an army. Then the real question would arise. Who was the rightful Lord of Winterfell? It was just over a fortnight after Jon's claim when the first letter arrived from Robb himself. A battered rider, half frozen by a late autumn snow squall, delivered the missive at dawn. Jon read it in the library tower with Maester Luwin standing by. It was short, lacking the flourish or extravagance of a southern lord's letter. Robb's words were direct, urgent, and tinged with disbelief. Jon, word has reached me that you have taken my seat in Winterfell, proclaiming yourself its protector. I cannot believe this rumor. My own brother could not betray me so. Yet the ravens arrive daily with tales of men calling you the rightful heir, some foolishly claiming Targaryen blood. If you have indeed allowed them to name you as Lord of Winterfell, then you must know the confusion it sows among my bannermen. I ride south to rescue our father and restore honor to our house. This is no time for the North to be divided. I urge you, as my brother and as a man of honor, to relinquish any such claims and hold Winterfell in my name alone until I return. If the North sees us united, we will stand strong against the Lannisters. Divided, we will fall. Remember who you are. We share the same father's blood. Let not the voices of others poison that bond. Robb Stark. Jon read it 3 times. The note demanded a response. A wave of shame and confusion broke over him. He had not written to Robb directly because he had never truly believed he was taking anything from him. It was a caretaker's role forced upon him by circumstance. But the rumors had escalated, and from Robb's perspective, it must look like open treachery. And yet, from Jon's vantage, stepping down now would plunge Winterfell into an immediate crisis. The Bolton threat, the Ironborn threat, outlaws in the country, without strong leadership, chaos would reign. Could he lead in Robb's name, as Robb asked? He was uncertain if that would suffice for those who had already cast their lots with Jon. Many demanded he be more than just a caretaker. He sank into a chair, the parchment crinkling in his grip. Maester Luwin set a hand on his shoulder. "We must reply at once," the old man urged softly. "Yes," Jon said. "Yes, of course." But what would he write? He spent the rest of that day in a haze, summoning lords and knights who remained. He laid out Robb's letter before them. Some insisted this was the perfect chance to unify under Robb. Others flatly refused, pointing out that Robb's absence and inexperience left him vulnerable to southern entanglements. Lady Dustin was the most outspoken. She sneered at the notion of bowing to a boy who had never lived through a real northern winter without the comforts of a father at his side. Jon bristled at that, defending Robb as best he could. But the seeds of doubt continued to sprout in the minds of those present. Perhaps Robb Stark had grown into a fine commander, perhaps not. Rumors that Robb had bested Jaime Lannister in battle spread like wildfire, but whether he could hold the North together in the face of internal conflict was another matter entirely. At day's end, Jon penned a reply. "Robb, I never intended to take your seat. I have claimed Winterfell only to protect the North from internal and external threats until you return. The men who demanded my leadership did so out of fear for our father's fate, and for the security of their homes while you march south. I do not wish to see the North divided. If you return, I will place Winterfell back into your hands without question. Until then, I will not abandon the seat, for too many lords look to me for guidance in these dire times. We cannot afford a power vacuum. I remain your loyal brother in blood and in heart, but I must serve the North as best I can. When you come home, I will kneel to you freely, as is your right. Until then, I hold Winterfell in our father's name. Jon Snow." He hesitated over the signature. Should he write Jon Stark or Jon Snow? Should he address himself as Lord of Winterfell or not? Finally, he left it as only Jon Snow. Let them see that he was no usurper. 3 days after that letter left, ravens brought fresh news. Ned Stark was dead, executed in King's Landing by King Joffrey Baratheon for treason. The realm reeled from the shock, but nowhere was the pain sharper than in the North. A hush fell across Winterfell when the black-winged messengers arrived. The cawing of crows outside the Maester's tower seemed a funeral dirge, echoing in stony corridors. Jon shut himself away for hours upon hearing the tidings, tears slipping unbidden down his cheeks, anger coiling in his chest. Ned Stark was not just a father in name. He was the man who had raised Jon, offered him some measure of acceptance. Now he was gone, his head on a spike. If the rumors were true, the North roared with fury. Lord Manderly, Lord Glover, Lord Umber. Each wrote to Winterfell in a flurry of grief and anger. Men demanded retribution, wanted to march south. Some called upon Jon to lead them. Others said Robb was already in the field, so Jon should send them to join Robb's forces. Every day brought new ravens, new demands. Winterfell was drowning in sorrow, and in the midst of that sorrow, the question of who led them grew even more urgent. Jon had no time to properly mourn. Each day, he was in council with this or that group of lesser lords, forging a plan to maintain order. The Umbers threatened to ride out and personally kill the next Lannister man they saw. The Boltons sat in the Dreadfort, apparently unresponsive, stirring suspicion. Most chillingly, word arrived that Tywin Lannister was mustering another great host near Harrenhal, and it was rumored that King Joffrey might plan a large-scale campaign to subdue the rebellious North. Meanwhile, the Iron Islands were once again active, their intentions unclear. 2 weeks passed in a grim haze of such tidings. Jon's only respite came in the quiet hours of the night, when he walked the battlements with Ghost, or knelt in the Godswood before the Heart Tree and tried to find some fleeting sense of solace. He prayed, if one could call it prayer, to whatever gods would listen. Perhaps the old gods, perhaps the new. All he wanted was for the bloodshed to end, for Ned's memory to be honored, for the North to stand united. But with every passing day, that unity seemed more and more fragile. Then came a second letter from Robb. This one was colder, more formal. Jon Snow, I have received your reply. I have also learned of our father's fate. I march now as king in the North, proclaimed by my bannermen. I have sworn to avenge our father, and to bring the Lannisters to their knees. I invite you to join me, to bend the knee as your rightful king. I will have your fealty, or else I must deem you a threat to the cause of the North's independence. I do not wish to spill my own brother's blood, but this is war, and I must unite our homeland under one banner. Remember your promise. Winterfell belongs to me by right of birth. As king in the North, I would welcome your support. But if you deny me, I will deal with you as I must deal with all who oppose me. I pray you choose wisely. Robb Stark, king in the North. Jon clenched the parchment in his fist. His brother, naming himself king in the North, had turned the page on old feudal loyalties. If Robb was now a king, that meant a new monarchy was taking root in the north, separate from the Iron Throne. It was a bold declaration, one that many lords had apparently embraced. Perhaps the plan was to break free from the tyranny of King's Landing entirely, to become once again the Kingdom of the North, as it had been long ago. Jon could almost hear Great Jon Umber's booming voice chanting, "The King in the North," as they had at the Twins. But for Robb to now threaten him, it cut deeper than Jon expected. Yet he understood. War forced men to extremes. If Robb believed Jon's claim would fracture the unity needed to fight the Lannisters, he would act. Jon read the letter again, focusing on the line, "Remember your promise." He had indeed promised that, upon Robb's return, he would relinquish Winterfell. But Robb was not returning alone. He was returning as a king with an army. And he demanded fealty right now without question. Maester Luwin found Jon pacing furiously in the Great Hall, the letter open on the table. The green and brown tapestry of Brandon the Builder behind him swayed in the draft from the open door. Jon's face was set like flint, eyes dark with emotion. If he declared for Robb openly, he risked losing the support of those who had pinned their hopes on him. More crucially, the situation in Winterfell was precarious. Word had spread that a large faction of common men and local lords believed Robb had abandoned the north for the south, enthralled by the Tullus and the River Lords. They needed someone who would safeguard them in their own land, focusing on the real threats at home. If Jon knelt to Robb now, some of these men might feel betrayed and desert, leaving Winterfell vulnerable to the Boltons or the Ironborn. Yet if Jon refused Robb's ultimatum, he risked open war with his own brother. Sitting down heavily in the wooden chair at the head of the table, Jon buried his face in his hands. "I want none of this," he murmured. "He is my brother, but I must do what's right for the North, just as he believes he must." That was when the next blow came, as a harried messenger stumbled into the great hall, nearly collapsing at Jon's feet. The man was covered in half-frozen mud, his cloak torn, and he clutched a piece of parchment in a trembling hand. His voice hoarse, he relayed grim news. The Bolton men had captured one of the smaller strongholds loyal to the Starks, burning it and slaying many. Other outlying villages near the Dreadfort had also been raided, the Boltons claiming it was done in the name of Northern Unity, and punishing those who bent the knee to the bastard. The message ended with a scrawled threat from Ramsay Snow, the bastard of Bolton, who styled himself the true Lord's bastard in mocking reference to Jon. Jon felt his blood chill. The Boltons had always been dangerous. With Robb away, they must see this conflict between Stark claimants as an opportunity to strike. Winterfell's defenders were spread thin, many having marched south with Robb, and if the Boltons continued to seize small holdfasts, it wouldn't be long before their grip grew. Suddenly, it was no longer a question of whether Jon or Robb was rightful. If the Boltons advanced, the question might be moot. Neither Stark might hold the castle in the end. Maester Luwin placed a trembling hand on Jon's shoulder. "We must do something at once. Bolton grows bolder by the day." So, forced to act, Jon rallied what men he could. The lords who had sworn to him were not so numerous as Robb's host, but they were enough to mount an expedition to push back the Bolton raids. Leading the troop personally, Jon set out from Winterfell with a few hundred men, a ragged force of knights, foot soldiers, and archers. He left a skeleton garrison to hold the castle, but that was a risk. If the Ironborn attacked or if any other house made a bid for Winterfell in his absence, the seat could fall. Yet action was needed, or the Boltons would pillage the countryside unchecked. Ghost bounded at Jon's side as they rode out the gates, the crisp autumn wind biting at their cheeks. They made for the lands between Winterfell and the Dreadfort. Snow had begun to fall, lightly at first, dusting the rolling hills and the northern roads. This was part of the might of the North, the unrelenting cold and isolation. It turned every journey into an ordeal, every campaign into a test of resilience. Jon recalled the rigors of the Night's Watch beyond the wall, reminding him that while these conditions were harsh, they were not altogether foreign to him. They marched for days, stopping only to rest and gather news from frightened villagers. Each settlement they passed bore signs of struggle. Broken doors, smashed furniture, fresh graves. Yet many villagers had fled at the first rumor of the Bolton men. Jon felt an ache in his chest with each new sign of cruelty. He had known that House Bolton was an old foe of House Stark, but he had never imagined facing them in pitched conflict. Not like this. Not in a time when the North was supposed to be uniting against the Lannisters. At last, near a dreary village of no more than a dozen huts, Jon's scouts found Bolton raiders camped by a shallow stream. They crept close, counting numbers by the flicker of campfires. It was a war band of about 60 men, led by a minor Bolton cousin. These men were well armed, but had grown lax in their confidence, apparently not expecting real resistance from Winterfell. Jon's force, though smaller than he would have liked, had the advantage of surprise. Just before dawn, he ordered the attack. It was a short, vicious skirmish. Jon led the charge, Ghost darting ahead to pounce on a Bolton sentry before the man could cry out. Steel clashed. Men shouted in terror and rage. Snow, churned into muddy slush, splattered boots and horses alike. Jon's men fought fiercely, fueled by grief and anger for what the Boltons had done to their homes. The surprise was total, and within minutes, the Bolton warband fell into disarray. A few tried to flee, only to be cut down by Jon's outriders. By sunrise, the warband was broken, their leader taken captive, a man named Serwin Bolton, with watery eyes and trembling hands. Jon stood over him, breath ragged in the morning chill, sword dripping blood onto the fresh snow. He could see the burning hatred in the man's eyes, tempered with fear. "Tell your lord," Jon said, "that I will not allow raids on innocent villagers. If Ramsay Bolton values his life, he will keep his dogs on a leash." Serwin spat, though his spit was tinged pink with blood from a split lip. "You're just the bastard playing at being lord," he hissed. "We'll see how long your bravado lasts." Jon's eyes flickered with a dangerous light, and for a moment, he was tempted to run the man through. But he resisted that dark impulse, stepping back. "Take him away," he ordered. "We'll keep him until we decide his fate. Mercy or justice." He did not yet know which was the better path. Though the victory was small, word of it traveled swiftly, heartening many who had feared the Boltons were unstoppable. Jon's men recounted how he fought in the thick of the fray, how his dire wolf tore men apart, how the usurper bastard showed no fear against the Dreadfort's cruelty. It became a new thread in the tapestry of rumor swirling around the north. Jon Snow, bastard of Ned Stark, might well be unstoppable. Some tried to brand him cold and ruthless, comparing him to his alleged Targaryen ancestors. Others saw him as the true heir to the fearless nature of the Kings of Winter. The truth was simpler. He was a young man caught in an impossible situation, desperately trying to do the right thing. More fights followed in the region between Winterfell and the Dreadfort. Ramsay Snow himself led a large group of men in a surprise raid that nearly caught Jon unawares. Bloody chaos erupted when a handful of Bolton outriders set fire to a small hamlet, using it as a trap to lure Jon's forces in. Jon led a rescue attempt, charging into the hamlet to save villagers from the flames, but Ramsay's men ambushed them. Jon and Ghost narrowly escaped being overwhelmed, thanks to a pair of loyal archers who picked off Bolton men from the rooftops. Ramsay retreated after taking a bolt to the shoulder, howling curses at Jon, vowing revenge. By the time a fortnight had passed in this brutal back and forth, Jon's men were running low on supplies. The roads were half frozen, and it was only mid-autumn. The real snows had yet to come. They needed to return to Winterfell to fortify and plan. The conflict with the Boltons had not ended, but at least they had stalled their advance. So Jon led his weary men home. They carried the wounded in wagons, along with half-starved villagers they had rescued. The trek was slow, fear dogging every step that Bolton outriders might appear again. They reached Winterfell in the early evening, just as the last light of the sun bled away into the horizon. The old walls rose up before them, cold and unyielding, yet to Jon, they felt like an embrace. Torches flickered along the battlements, where the skeleton garrison stood watch. Under normal circumstances, the courtyard would have bustled with stable hands, blacksmiths, and bustling scullions, but it felt subdued, the gloom accentuated by the glint of newly fallen snow. Men rushed out to help the returning soldiers, exclamations of relief echoing through the yard. Squires led weary horses to the stables, while the wounded were carried off to the maester's tower. Jon dismounted, exhaustion weighing on him like a cloak of iron. Ghost trotted at his side, muzzle matted with dried blood. Maester Luwin hurried forth with anxious eyes, and Lady Dustin watched from a corner with her characteristic smirk, arms folded beneath her fur cloak. He dreaded the political maneuvers that surely awaited, but for now he had a simple imperative: see to the wounded, plan for the next steps, and rest. Yet the respite he longed for would be brief, as the next day brought fresh tidings. Ravens from Robb Stark, from the Dreadfort, from Bear Island, from lords great and small. War would not pause for a single battered band of men to gather their strength. Within Winterfell's great hall that night, a subdued feast was arranged for the returning soldiers. It was meager by the standards of the castle's storied history, but the cooks did their best, roasting a few pigs and serving strong ale. Men recounted tales of the skirmishes, praising Jon, or chastising him for taking too many risks. As Jon picked at his plate, Lady Dustin approached, her sharp gaze unwavering. She wore a black dress with red embroidery, reminiscent of a House Dustin color scheme, though it bore an uncanny echo of House Targaryen's colors as well. "You made progress," she said, her voice quietly cutting through the din. "But not enough to end the threat of the Boltons. They'll be back." Jon looked up, meeting her eyes. "I know," he said, "but we can't fight them outright with the numbers we have." She gave a soft laugh. "Perhaps not, but you've proven to those who doubted you that you can stand firm, that you won't let the Boltons roam free. That will earn you respect or fear, which is just as useful." "Fear is not what I want," she shrugged. "Want rarely matters in times like these. Fear, loyalty, love. They all blend together when war is upon us." His brow furrowed in thought. "What is it you truly want, Lady Dustin? You've aided me, but I know your history with House Stark is complicated." Her lips curved into a thin smile. "I want the North to be free of fools," she said. "Whether that is Robb Stark, you, or someone else doesn't matter as much to me as ensuring that the North does not fall victim to Southern arrogance again. You, Jon Snow, may be of Stark blood and perhaps Targaryen blood, yet you grew up here among these walls. That may make you more palatable in my eyes than some boy king enthralled by his Riverlander mother's family." She sipped a goblet of wine. "But I will not tolerate hesitation forever." He took in her words. She was telling him, in her own way, to show no weakness if he wanted her continued support. That realization settled like a stone in his stomach. She was one of several northern lords and ladies who had flocked to him, each with their own agendas. If he faltered, they might turn on him or at least withdraw, leaving him adrift without enough allies to hold Winterfell against the Boltons or any other threat. "Your father once commanded respect without needing to raise his voice," Lady Dustin continued. "You might learn from that. The common folk adore you as Ned's son. Do not waste that adoration." She departed, and Jon was left with the clamor of the hall swirling around him. He glanced down at Ghost lying by his feet. The direwolf's ears perked, as if listening to the undercurrent of tension. Jon was too tired for more conversation. Quietly slipping away from the table, he made for the dim corridors that led to his old bedchamber. The narrow hallway walls cast black shadows in the sputtering torchlight. He felt a pang of memory as he passed the corridor leading to the rooms where he once slept as a child. Memories of running with Robb, of hiding from Sansa's teasing or Arya's pranks. Those times seemed from another life. He found the chamber assigned to him, stripped down his armor, and collapsed onto the straw mattress, drifting into a dreamless sleep. At dawn, he was awakened by loud knocking. A steward rushed in as soon as Jon gave permission to enter, holding a fresh bundle of letters, the wax seals unbroken. "Ravens arrived, Lord," he stammered. "They bear King Robb's seal, and others from the Manderlys, the Glovers, Bear Island, and the Dreadfort." Jon's weariness evaporated. He nodded curtly, dismissing the steward. One by one, he opened the letters. Most bore pleasantries, half-veiled threats, or requests for clarifications on his stance. The letter from Robb was the longest. "Jon, I ride for Moat Cailin soon. The Lannisters have taken Riverrun, capturing our grandfather Tully. Our forces are divided. I call upon you to muster all loyal Northmen to march south to join me. If you refuse, you not only defy me as your king, but you condemn House Tully to the Lannisters' mercy. Our father is gone, but we can still save our mother's kin. Join me, or I will return to Winterfell with steel in hand. Choose. Robb King in the north." Jon's hands shook. If he gathered the men in Winterfell to march south, who would protect the north from the Boltons and the looming threat of the Ironborn? Yet if he did not, he would be painted as a traitor to the cause of the north and to his brother. Another letter from Willa Manderly expressed condolences for Ned's death and an eagerness to follow the rightful Stark heir, though it did not clarify whether she meant Robb or Jon. A cryptic line read, "Should you swear loyalty to the king in the north, White Harbor shall remain your steadfast ally. We have no desire for further divisions among us." That was a gentle push for him to bend the knee to Robb. From Bear Island came a sterner note. "We have always pledged our swords to House Stark. We do not wish to see two Starks fighting. King Robb is the rightful heir, but we do not cast aside Eddard's other son. Unite or watch the North fall." That last line weighed heavily on Jon. The letter from the Dreadfort was more chilling, signed by Roose Bolton. "Bastard of Winterfell, your father's day is done. If you cling to the seat, you will suffer the flaying knife. Surrender Winterfell, or we shall take it. Our men are legion." The arrogance and threat were plain. Jon set the letters aside and sat there quietly. This was the turning point. War was not a game of small decisions. He had to choose where Winterfell stood. If he marched south, he might unify with Robb, but leave the north vulnerable. If he refused, he risked being labeled a usurper and seeing the might of Robb's host turned against him someday soon. That could leave Winterfell open to a two-front struggle against Robb's returning army and the Boltons, which was no path to victory. The morning light through the chamber's narrow window illuminated specks of dust dancing in the air, a stark reminder that life continued in the smallest forms while men decided the fate of thousands. Outside, the wind stirred, bringing the smell of fresh snow. Ghost lay curled at the foot of Jon's bed, ears perked up as if sensing his master's turmoil. In the corridor, Maester Luwin soon arrived, pushing the heavy wooden door open. He found Jon hunched over the letters, silent. "You have read them?" the Maester asked gently. "I have," Jon murmured. "You cannot hold Winterfell in defiance of Robb forever," Luwin said, stepping closer with measured steps. "Nor can you ignore the Boltons. If we march south, we must leave enough to defend the castle." Jon rubbed his forehead. "Do we have enough men?" The Maester sighed. "We can muster perhaps 2,000, if we call upon the lesser houses who've pledged to you, but many are reluctant to march far. Winter is near, and a call to arms might empty their lands of men needed to hunt and store provisions. And if the Boltons gather their own strength, they could muster more?" Luwin nodded gravely. "Potentially, but Roose Bolton is with Robb's army, or so rumor says, at least part of the time. Ramsay, however, is closer to home. If they consolidate at the Dreadfort, they might field a force that could threaten Winterfell." Jon stood, pacing. "I must speak with the lords. We need a plan to defend Winterfell and to show Robb that I am not his enemy." He paused. "And yet, he calls himself king in the north. If I swear fealty to him, that means I accept his monarchy. If so, I can't do so half-heartedly. I must be fully behind him, or he won't trust me." Luwin lowered his gaze. "That is the crux of it. You either stand with Robb Stark and his war, or stand separate as a second claimant to the north, thus giving the Boltons more leverage. One would hope for a compromise, but war seldom favors compromise." Jon pressed his palms to the rough wood of the table. Memories flooded back. Ghost bounding through the yard alongside Grey Wind, Robb clapping him on the shoulder in the training yard, each testing the other's swordsmanship. They had been more friends than brothers at times, so close in age. Now the distance between them was a gulf of war and politics. "I don't want to fight Robb," Jon said quietly, fists clenched. "I won't." Maester Luwin nodded, a faint glimmer of relief in his eyes. "Then perhaps your path is clear. But the men who supported your claim, some will feel betrayed or at least uncertain if you bend the knee to Robb. A wise leader might find a way to keep them loyal while fulfilling your familial duty." That morning, Jon assembled his council. Lady Dustin appeared with her perpetual half-smile, her eyes searching Jon's face for clues. Several lesser lords from the mountains and the hills came, as well as knights who had sworn to Jon over the past months. The great hall was cold, the hearth fire flickering and sputtering as a downdraft funneled from the upper chimney. Jon stood by the high table, meeting their expectant gazes. "Robb Stark is declared king in the north," he announced. "He calls upon us to march south, to save our kin and strike back at the Lannisters." He let the words settle, watching the subtle changes in expression among those assembled. Some nodded in approval, others looked worried, and Lady Dustin's gaze hardened. "I have promised from the beginning that when my brother returns, I will yield this seat. He is returning now as a king, and I will honor my word." A ripple of murmurs spread through the council. One knight leaned forward, brow furrowed. "So, you will ride south and leave us to face the Boltons alone?" Jon shook his head. "No, I will not abandon Winterfell. A portion of our men will stay behind, enough to defend the castle if the Boltons attack. I will command them. Another portion will march south under a trusted commander. They will join Robb's forces, showing him we are not divided. But I cannot simply leave Winterfell undefended, especially with the Boltons' aggression." Lady Dustin's lips twisted in a smirk. "Then you plan to remain behind these walls while sending others to do your fighting for you? That hardly seems like the grand leadership many hoped for." Her words were like a slap. Jon squared his shoulders. "I'm not hiding. We must ensure the Boltons do not seize the north behind Robb's back. If they succeed, then even if Robb wins his battles in the south, he will have no home to return to. The men who remain here will protect the north from internal threats. Those who march south do so with our blessing. We must fight on two fronts." A hush enveloped the hall. Some men exchanged uncertain glances, but a large portion nodded, seemingly reassured by the idea of a dual strategy. Maester Luwin stepped forward. "Who shall command the force that marches south to join King Robb?" Jon's throat constricted. He had not fully decided. But there was one man present who was a seasoned battle leader, albeit a controversial figure. "Lord Wool," Jon said at last, addressing a tall, weathered man with a thick gray beard from the mountain clans. "You have fought the clans of the hills for years, and you've shown courage and cunning. Will you lead our men?" Lord Wool scratched at his beard, appraising Jon with squinting eyes. "I can, if that's your command. We have no love for the Lannisters." "Thank you," Jon replied, exhaling a breath. "You will march under the Stark banner. Inform Robb that Winterfell remains loyal and will guard the north. I will await word from him. If circumstances allow, I will ride south with more men later." Another wave of murmurs. Lady Dustin only watched, her expression inscrutable. The next day, nearly 1,000 men assembled in Winterfell's courtyard to march south. It was a cold, gray morning, the wind biting. Jon stood at the gates, clad in a thick fur cloak, while Lord Wool mustered the men. Banners fluttered. Mostly the direwolf of House Stark, a few banners of smaller houses who had thrown their lot in with Jon. Jon noticed that a number of these men still seemed torn, uncertain whether they marched for Robb or for Jon. But with a final command, Lord Wool led them out, a long column of horses, wagons, and men on foot. They set forth on the King's Road, bound for Moat Cailin and ultimately to join Robb's host wherever he might be engaged. Jon stood watching until they vanished around a bend, feeling as if some part of him rode away with them. He spent the remainder of that day making arrangements for defense, consulting with Maester Luwin about supply stocks, and quietly pondering how Robb might respond. Would Robb accept this half measure? Possibly, though Jon suspected his brother might resent the fact that Jon himself had not come in person. But it was the best plan. Jon had to prevent the Boltons from exploiting the absence of a garrison. Indeed, the Boltons did not remain idle. Within a week, outriders reported a large force gathering near the Dreadfort. Ramsay Snow had apparently called the banners loyal to the Boltons, enticing or coercing them into a mustering. The numbers were uncertain, but the signs suggested a serious attempt on Winterfell might be in the offing. The friction between the Starks' double claims gave the Boltons a perfect excuse to strike. Any perceived weakness would encourage them. Still, Jon refused to let fear dominate. He strengthened the walls, set additional guards, and prepared for siege if necessary. Lady Dustin, for her part, continued to hover near him, whispering dark observations. "Ramsay is a beast," she said. "He delights in cruelty. Do not expect him to play by the rules of chivalry. If he manages to breach the walls, you can expect no quarter." Jon nodded grimly. "We will not let him breach the walls. Winterfell has stood for thousands of years." As the days dragged on, fresh snows blanketed the courtyard. The wards of Winterfell, warmed by the ancient hot springs, kept parts of the castle free of ice, but beyond the walls, the fields grew white. Inside, tension wound tighter with each passing day without word from Robb or from the southern forces. Men grew restless. Stories of Ramsay Snow's atrocities circulated, fueling dread. Yet another letter from King Joffrey arrived, mocking the North's rebellion and threatening to send an army. Jon quietly burned it in the hearth. Finally, one day near twilight, a horn blast at the gates announced riders approaching. Jon rushed to the ramparts. The glow of torches illuminated half a dozen men on horseback, their breath clouding the frosty air. The gates swung open cautiously. Jon recognized one of them as the northern scout who had ridden with Lord Wool's contingent. The man's face was drawn with worry. "We come from Moat Cailin with news," he shouted up. Jon descended to greet them in the courtyard, cloak trailing across the snow-dusted ground. Maester Luwin stood at his side, as did Lady Dustin and a handful of Jon's guards. The arriving riders swung off their horses, stiff from days on the road. "What news?" Jon demanded, his voice tight. "Lord Wool has joined forces with King Robb's men near Moat Cailin," the scout explained. "But the king requests your immediate presence. He demands an audience with you, my lord, to clarify your intentions. He's insisted you come in person or send a raven to arrange a parley." Jon's heart sank. So Robb was not content with the men Jon had sent. He wanted Jon's personal fealty. A conversation might solve things, or it might tear them further apart. But ignoring the summons would only sow more mistrust. He glanced at Maester Luwin, who merely nodded, a subtle sign that a meeting was inevitable. Lady Dustin gave him a sharp look. "If you leave now, Ramsay Snow might see it as an opportunity to strike." "I know," Jon replied softly, "but if I do not meet Robb, we risk open conflict with our own brother." She shrugged. "Then we must be cunning in our preparations." That night, Jon summoned his key supporters and arranged for the defense to remain strong even in his absence. He would take a small escort, hopefully slipping past the Dreadfort's watchers, trusting that the roads were not entirely blocked by Bolton men. It was a risk. If the Boltons learned of his leaving, they might attempt a siege. But he trusted that the walls of Winterfell, guarded by loyal men, could hold. Dawn found Jon at the stables, mounting a hardy northern mare. Ghost padded alongside, refusing to be left behind. A handful of guards and knights formed up, carrying the Stark banner. Lady Dustin watched from the courtyard steps, a faint smirk curving her lips. "Go if you must," she said. "But I doubt your brother will be kind if he suspects you're still a rival for Winterfell's loyalty." Jon met her gaze. "I have no desire to be his rival. Desires mean little. Appearances mean much." Jon spurred his horse on. The wooden gates of Winterfell swung open, and he led his party out into the swirling snow. The journey south was fraught with tension, the forest tracks muffled by the thick white carpet. Ravens croaked in the leafless branches overhead, as if mocking men's ambitions. At each turn, Jon feared encountering Bolton patrols. They traveled as swiftly as they dared, wary of unseen watchers. But fortune smiled on them. They passed no sign of the dread flayed man's sigil. The real risk was the weather, which threatened to turn into a biting storm. More than once, they had to pause and shelter behind thick stands of pine or in a half-buried inn. Finally, Moat Caelin's ruined towers rose before them, dark silhouettes against an overcast sky. The boggy ground and half-frozen marsh made approach difficult, but scouts from Robb's host guided them around the worst patches. The ancient stronghold that once defended the north from southern invasions was now a battered shell of its old glory. Still, it stood as the gateway to the land beyond. Jon saw encampments spread out around the fortress, tents of many colors, mostly gray with the direwolf sigil, but also some from House Tully and House Fry. Smoke rose from numerous fires, the smell of cooking meat mingling with the crisp air. As Jon's group entered the camp, they were met with a mixture of stares, some hostile, others merely curious. Rumors must have preceded Jon, labeling him a rival, a usurper, or something else entirely. They were directed to a large pavilion near one of the crumbling towers. Outside the pavilion, a half-dozen guards stood, wearing the sigil of House Stark. They stiffened at the sight of Jon and his escort, but parted to let him pass when he announced himself. Ghost tried to enter alongside him, but the guards shifted nervously. Jon gave a slight nod to his men, and Ghost waited outside, hackles half-raised. Jon pushed aside the tent flap. Inside, the warmth of braziers fought the chill. Map tables cluttered the center, and men in mail or leather-studded jerkins ringed around them. Robb Stark stood at the far side, back turned, conferring with his advisors. Even from behind, Jon recognized him. The broad shoulders, the auburn hair curling at the nape of his neck, the way he stood with a subtle tension that signaled both youth and command. By his side, Theon Greyjoy lingered, wearing a grin that faded when he caught sight of Jon. Also present were several Northmen, the great Jon Umber, Rickard Karstark, and Roose Bolton himself, stoic in a pale fur cloak. Roose's pale eyes flicked to Jon with interest. Robb turned at the sound of the tent flap. His gray eyes locked onto Jon's, and for a moment, a flash of brotherly affection broke through the tension. But it vanished quickly as he remembered the circumstances. He wore a crown of bronze and iron on his head, a new creation that signaled his title as king in the north. Jon forced himself to speak calmly. "Your Grace," he said, bowing stiffly. He had never imagined calling Robb that. "I have come as requested." Robb studied him, his jaw tight. "My lord brother," he replied. "I almost doubted you'd come." "I came to show my loyalty," Jon said, fighting the knot in his throat. "Winterfell stands with you, and I've sent men to join your ranks. I remain to guard the seat from the Boltons." Robb's mouth pressed into a line. The great Jon stepped forward, looming in his bear-like presence, fists on hips. "You've sent some men," the great Jon growled. "But the question is, are you with the king in the north, or do you style yourself some other rightful lord?" Jon stiffened. "I style myself as no king, my lords. I made it plain from the start that I was only protecting Winterfell in Robb's absence." "Your father is gone," Roose Bolton said in a voice like softly sliding ice, "which means your brother is the rightful lord of Winterfell, or king in the north if that is your preference. Why should any man follow you, Snow?" Jon's eyes flicked to Bolton. For all that Ramsay was said to be the monster, Roose was possibly more frightening in his composed malice. "Because I was the one holding Winterfell when my brother marched south. I protected the small folk from your men's raids." Roose allowed the faintest curl of his lip. "My son, you mean. Ramsay is overzealous. But let us not pretend the bastard of Bolton acts without his father's knowledge." Robb slammed a fist onto the map table, making the wooden figures tremble. "Enough. This conversation is about the loyalty of the North." His eyes bored into Jon. "Do you kneel to me as your king? Or must I consider you a threat to our unity?" Jon's throat felt dry. All eyes were on him. Some, like Theon Greyjoy, wore an amused half-smile, as if anticipating a spectacle. Others, like Rickard Karstark, looked weary of betrayal. The Great John seemed impatient, while Roose Bolton's face was a mask of polite neutrality. Jon could sense the precarious nature of this moment. One misstep, and swords could be drawn. "My brother," Jon began carefully, swallowing, "I kneel to you as the king in the north. You are Ned Stark's trueborn son, the rightful heir to Winterfell. I never intended to dispute that. I have only done what I thought necessary to protect our home while you have been waging war against the Lannisters." The tension in Robb's stance eased, ever so slightly, but the lines on his face remained. "Then do it," he said, voice hoarse. Jon took a deep breath. He stepped forward, sank to one knee on the rough canvas floor of the pavilion. The eyes of everyone in the tent bored into him, while his heart hammered. He bowed his head. "My king, I pledge my life and honor to you as your loyal vassal." No one moved for a moment. Robb exhaled slowly, setting the tension in the room free. After a beat, he nodded. "Rise then, brother," he said, stepping forward. Jon stood, and they faced each other closely for the first time in months. Robb removed his glove and clasped Jon's wrist. Their eyes met, a flicker of the old bond they shared. "I accept your loyalty," Robb said, voice quieter. "We have bled too much already." A wave of relief washed through Jon, but out of the corner of his eye, he saw Roose Bolton's expression remain unreadable. The Great John let out a booming laugh. Rickard Karstark nodded solemnly. Theon Greyjoy just arched an eyebrow, though he eventually smirked. "We stand united, at least," Robb said to the gathered lords. "The North cannot afford to be torn from within." Jon nodded, swallowing. "What would you have of me, your grace?" Robb gestured to the map. "We plan to move against the Lannisters holding Riverrun, but we face another threat. The Ironborn have begun raiding the coast. My father by marriage, Walder Frey, has pledged men, but we cannot be sure of his loyalty. With our forces divided, we need someone to ensure the North remains secure from the Boltons and any other who might threaten our rear. Someone I can trust." Jon could sense the words about to come. "You want me to stay behind as Warden of the North in your stead," he said. Robb glanced at the lords, then nodded. "A caretaker, if you will, under my authority. It will allow me to push south with the bulk of our forces, knowing that Winterfell is in safe hands." He paused. "Our father would have wanted us to work together. I'm sure of it." Jon felt a pang at the mention of Ned. Then he nodded, the tension in his chest easing. "I will do as you command. The Boltons won't breach Winterfell while I still draw breath." "Good," Robb said, a note of gratitude in his voice, "because we'll need the North intact if we're to free the Riverlands and avenge our father." A hush followed, and Jon felt a flicker of hope that perhaps the North would not be torn in two after all. But an uneasy sense of foreboding churned within him. It was not so simple to quell the ambitions of the Boltons or the swirling rumors about his parentage. He had knelt, yes, but some men might see that as mere theater. Perhaps it would buy enough time for the North to weather the storms ahead. All he could do was try. Robb called for a cask of ale to celebrate, and while cups were filled, some more grudgingly than others, Jon stood next to his brother, aware that the uneasy truce might be fragile. Roose Bolton approached, offering a thin smile. "Congratulations, my lord. Or should I say, my lord caretaker of the North. Do mind Ramsay for me, won't you?" The words were polite, but the tone was not. Jon met his pale gaze. "We will handle him, for the good of the North." Bolton's smile did not reach his eyes. "Yes, for the good of the North." Robb lifted a cup, proclaiming, "To the North!" The lords echoed with a shout. Jon joined, forcing conviction into his voice. Somewhere outside, Ghost let out a soft growl, as if aware that the path to unity was far from certain. That night, after the war councils ended, Jon and Robb found a rare moment to speak alone. They stood atop the ruined walls of Moat Cailin, the marshes spread out below them in a tapestry of silver under the moonlight. Their cloaks flapped in the biting wind, and in that lonely place, they felt the rawness of their shared grief. "I'm sorry about Father," Jon said, voice low. "I should have been there. Maybe I could have done something." Robb shook his head. "It wasn't your fault. We were all scattered. I was in the camps planning to cross the Twins. Arya and Sansa were in King's Landing." He trailed off, his eyes haunted. "I can't get the image out of my head. The idea of Father on his knees, executed like a common criminal. The Lannisters will pay." Jon squeezed Robb's shoulder. "They will," he said quietly. "Whatever the cost, they will. But we must be careful, or the North will pay the cost too." Robb nodded, turning to gaze out over the dark horizon. "That's why I needed to know I could trust you. If the Boltons rise up behind us while I'm fighting the Lannisters, we'll be caught between two enemies." "You can trust me," Jon said earnestly. "I have no interest in fracturing the North. I only took that seat to keep it safe." Robb's gaze softened. "I believe you. I always did on some level. But some of my bannermen, they whispered that you might covet Winterfell, that your rumored Targaryen blood might lead you to, I don't know. They say many foolish things." Jon sighed. "I never asked for any of that. Just tell me what you need me to do, and I'll do it." Robb clasped his hand. "Protect the North. Guard our home. That's all I ask." Jon nodded, their eyes meeting for a moment. An unspoken bond passed between them, though it was tinged with sadness and the knowledge that war might yet drive them apart again. For tonight, at least, they were brothers again, sharing grief and responsibility, standing on an ancient wall under the cold, unblinking stars. When morning came, the bulk of Robb's forces began to break camp. Wagons rolled south, men tramped across half-frozen mud, and war horns sounded a low note of departure. Jon and his small escort prepared to return north, back to Winterfell, back to the looming threat of Ramsay Snow. The brothers parted on the outskirts of the camp, Robb dressed in mail and leather, crown resting on his auburn curls, Theon and others at his side. Jon clasped Robb's forearm in farewell. "May the gods watch over you," Jon said quietly. Robb inclined his head. "And you still have family in the south, our sisters. I'll do what I can to save them." Jon's throat tightened. He thought of Sansa's gentleness, Arya's stubbornness. "I know you will." The horns sounded again, and men began to move. The last glimpse Jon had of Robb was his brother turning away to speak with Theon about the route to the Twins. Then he was gone, swallowed by the mass of soldiers heading south. Jon took a deep breath, turning his mare's head north. Ghost trotted beside him, and his escort fell into line. The journey back to Winterfell began, the sky overhead a pale gray that threatened more snow. Though Jon had knelt before Robb and reaffirmed their bond, a sense of unease lingered in his chest. The Boltons would not simply abandon their ambitions, and if the rumors of Jon's Targaryen blood persisted, if men continued to rally to him against Robb's wishes, a new conflict could yet erupt. For now, though, he had a duty, one that aligned, at least temporarily, with his brother's cause. He would return to Winterfell and guard the North. The rest would unfold as the gods willed, or as men made it. Perhaps the lines drawn in the snow would melt come spring, or perhaps they would harden into scars. As the wind whistled through the pines and the swirl of flakes caught in the morning light, Jon prayed silently for a day when the Stark family might once again stand united in Winterfell's great hall, free of southern war and internal strife. Whether that day would come, like all dreams, remained uncertain. But for now, it was enough to spur him onward, through the snow and the cold, toward home. Jon Snow's ride north from Moat Cailin was a cold, quiet affair. The small band that accompanied him numbered fewer than a dozen. A handful of loyal guards, a pair of archers, and a taciturn knight with more scars than teeth. Snow swirled across the beaten path, whipped into curlicues by the biting wind. The land here was largely flat, save for patches of swamp or low hills. After the final moor gave way to the wide, open road, the real emptiness began. Not even crows broke the silence. The world felt abandoned by all but winter's chill. Jon found himself lost in thought for much of the journey. He had fulfilled his vow to kneel to Robb and reaffirm his loyalty, but a restlessness gnawed at him. Duty demanded he return to Winterfell and secure it against the Boltons' aggression. Yet, as he rode, he could not shake the sense that too many threats encroached upon the north. He worried about Robb, king in the north, burdened with the south's battles. He worried about Ramsay, who lurked in the distance like a hungry wolf. He worried about rumors of his own bloodline. His Targaryen ancestry whispered among both allies and enemies. A swirl of burdens pressed upon him, heavier than his cloak. Ghost trotted in the snow at his side, nearly invisible against the whiteness save for the pink of his ears and the watchful glint of his red eyes. Whenever Jon's horse slowed, Ghost would halt and look up, as if questioning his master's hesitation. Their bond felt like a single lifeline in a sea of confusion. After 3 days' steady travel, winter's gloom deepened. The wind carried a promise of heavier snowfall, and the sky remained perpetually gray. On the morning of the 4th day, they cut across a wide, frozen bog, forced to pick their way carefully around the weakest spots. At midday, they stopped to give the horses a brief rest and to gnaw on dried salt beef. Jon crouched near a meager fire, ignoring the biting cold in his fingertips. The men around him spoke in low voices, expressions drawn. Their chatter drifted to the Boltons and the possible siege of Winterfell. None knew precisely how many men Ramsay could muster, but all feared it would be enough. A rider approached at speed from the south, sending up pale plumes of snow behind his horse's hooves. Jon tensed, hand on the hilt of Long Claw, but soon he recognized the sigil on the man's worn surcoat, the running direwolf, one of Robb's scouts. The scout dismounted, breathing hard. "My Lord Snow," he said, head bowed. "Your brother ordered me to ride hard after you. There's word from the south. Riverrun is besieged. Lord Tully's men attempt to hold the castle, but the Lannisters threaten daily assault. The king in the north marches with haste. He sends regrets that you had to leave so soon. He thought you should know in case ravens do not reach you." Jon nodded grimly. "Tell Robb I received his message and that Winterfell is prepared to stand firm. If he has need of more men, we'll find a way, but the Boltons remain a threat behind our lines. He must understand I cannot leave Winterfell empty." The scout offered a short bow and turned his horse, galloping back into the swirling drifts. Jon watched him vanish, mind heavy with the troubles that multiplied by the day. So the war in the south intensified. The Tullys in peril. Robb forced to scramble. It only strengthened Jon's resolve to secure the north so that at least one front would not collapse. They resumed their journey shortly thereafter. The group traveled into the evening, the cold intensifying with every mile. At last, on the eve of the 6th day, they glimpsed Winterfell in the distance, the ancient stronghold's lights flickering through the dark. Its high walls, ringed with a faint shimmer of rising steam from the hot springs, stood like a somber sentinel against the bleak sky. Jon felt a strange mixture of relief and dread stirring in his chest. He was home, yet the conflicts within might rival any threat from without. They made their way through the open gates, hailed by guards who peered warily from the torchlight. The courtyard looked subdued, the usual bustle reduced by winter's early approach. Even so, stable boys hurried to take the horses, and several men in the yard called out greetings. Jon returned a curt nod, noticing how many gazes flicked toward Ghost. The direwolf padded through the snow with silent menace, setting a few hearts to flutter. Once dismounted, Jon looked to the ramparts, half expecting some challenge from a bitter lord or a whispering lady, but he saw only tired men and a swirl of snow. He glanced at the great keep, imagining the warmth beyond its thick stone walls. "See to the horses," he ordered softly. "Then find food and rest." He made his way to the keep alone. Inside the great hall, a single hearth fire crackled. Several men were gathered near it, amongst them Maester Luwin and, of course, Lady Barbary Dustin. She turned upon hearing the doors echo, and a slow smile curved her lips. "Ah, you've returned," she said. "And still breathing, I see." Jon's shoulders felt stiff. The days of riding had left him weary, but Lady Dustin's sly tone only added to the weight. "We were fortunate," he replied. "No trouble on the road. Has anything changed here?" She let out a soft chuckle, gesturing to the hall's emptiness. "No open attacks yet, if that's what you mean, but rumors swirl. Ramsay Snow has been busy in the countryside, and some lords whisper that this ongoing tension between you and Robb, regardless of any kneeling, has weakened the north. They fear an assault before the snows grow too deep for an army to move." Jon's jaw tightened. "Robb and I stand together. I knelt to him at Moat Cailin. These rumors must be silenced." Lady Dustin arched an eyebrow. "Rumors rarely bend to the will of men, no matter their station. If you want them quiet, you'll need to prove unity in deeds, not just words." He noticed Maester Luwin hovering, a worried cast to his features. The maester stepped forward, old eyes kind. "Jon, welcome home. We have had ravens from Lord Bolton, demanding you yield Winterfell immediately. He claims the king in the north has no jurisdiction to give you a caretaker's right. He stands by the old ways, that the Dreadfort will not accept a bastard's guardianship." Luwin took a breath, scanning Jon's reaction. "Of course, we have no intention of complying." Jon nodded stiffly. "We do not. Ramsay or Roose can challenge us if they wish, but Winterfell will not bow to them. Boltons have a long tradition of rebellion against the Starks. They see opportunity in the current strife." Lady Dustin's expression turned pensive. "They will test your walls soon enough. With each passing day, they recruit or force small holdfasts to feed their growing army. If you cannot muster a show of strength, they may attempt a siege." Jon exhaled. He yearned for a quiet meal and rest, but pressing matters allowed no respite. He noticed a few other lords warming themselves by the hearth, all turning to watch him with curious eyes. "Lady Dustin," he said carefully, "how many swords can we rely on from your people should the Boltons move against us?" She drummed her fingers on the arm of the wooden chair she occupied. "I can commit a few hundred from Barrowton, if I recall them at once. More might come if I truly press them, but winter's approach makes them reluctant. We may have no choice. Will you summon them?" She inclined her head. "I will do so, though not all will arrive swiftly. In these conditions, weeks can pass before ravens are answered and men mustered." Jon turned to Maester Luwin. "Send messages to the houses still loyal to us, House Serwin, House Tallheart, the Glovers of Deepwood Motte if we can. We need to assemble a force here for immediate defense. Make it clear that King Robb authorized me to safeguard Winterfell. Any lord who defies that risks being named a traitor to the king in the north." Maester Luwin bowed. "I will send the ravens at first light." Lady Dustin's smile shifted to a more thoughtful expression. "You are stepping more firmly into your role, Jon Snow. If you hope to hold the seat, you must not hesitate. Men can smell doubt like hounds on a hunt." Jon's face remained carefully composed. "I have no time for doubt. If the Boltons come, we must be ready." With that, he excused himself, too exhausted for further conversation. The meager dinner he took in the hall was tasteless, as worry roiled in his mind. Afterward, he dragged himself to the privacy of his old bedchamber, dropping his travel-stained cloak on a bench. Ghost followed, curling at the foot of the narrow bed. Jon sank onto the mattress, boots still on, feeling the pang of returned memories. Nights at Castle Black, nights as a child in these very corridors, nights imagining a different life that never came. Sleep claimed him swiftly, though it brought no comfort. He awoke before dawn to the sound of hurried footsteps outside his door. He shot upright, hand on Longclaw's hilt, and called, "Who is it?" A muffled voice. "It's me, Darren, my lord. Maester Luwin sent me." Jon pulled the door open. A young steward stood there, face ashen in the flickering torchlight. "What's happened?" Jon asked. "Ravens in the night," the steward said anxiously. "Lord Serwin of House Serwin was found murdered in his solar. Some say Bolton men are behind it, but no one knows how they got inside the castle. His heir is just a boy of 7. Jon hissed a breath through his teeth. House Serwin was a vital ally just a short distance from Winterfell. If the Lord was murdered, that seat would be in chaos. Has a raven come from the new Lord or the Regent? Yes, my lord. They beg for help. There's fear that the Boltons will force them into submission now that leadership is uncertain. Jon wanted to curse. House Serwin's proximity made it a key stepping stone to Winterfell. If the Boltons gained control there, they could tighten a noose around the heart of the North. I'll speak with Maester Luwin at once. Rally a small escort if needed. Yes, my lord. The steward hurried off. Jon splashed his face with water from a basin, pulled on a clean tunic and breeches, and braided leather bracers over his forearms. He stuffed his hair beneath a fur cap, though a few dark curls escaped. Ghost padded after him, nails clicking softly on the stone floor. In Maester Luwin's chamber, the old man was already hunched over a desk littered with parchment and half-melted candles. He glanced up, worry etched into the lines of his face. You've heard. Jon nodded. Who rules in Serwin now? An uncle, the boy's great-uncle, has taken regency, but the man is aging and feeble. He pleads for guidance. Rumor has it that a group of Bolton riders was seen near their lands 2 nights before. No one can prove they gained entry, but suspicion abounds. Jon set his jaw. We must not let Bolton intimidate them into switching allegiance. But if I leave Winterfell again, I risk the castle's security. The Boltons could strike here while I'm away. Luwin nodded, folding his hands. Indeed, perhaps a small delegation, someone you trust, could go to reassure House Serwin and help them organize their defenses. A show of strength, even if minimal, might steady their resolve. Jon's gaze fell to the table. Who do we have that can represent me effectively? He was loath to send Lady Dustin. Her motives were often too complex. Nor did he want to dispatch men who were inexperienced in politics. Maester Luwin tapped the side of his chin in thought. Ser Roderick Castle would have been ideal, but he marched with Robb. We have Ser Reynold Faring, that knight from the south who swore himself to your service last month. Or the Karstarks, some remain though most marched with Robb. Or perhaps Lord Malember, who arrived recently seeking refuge. Jon frowned. Ser Reynold was relatively untested. Karstark men might be viewed with suspicion by House Serwin because of Rickard Karstark's own troubles. Lord Malember was an unknown quantity, an older man from a minor branch of a mountain clan. None were perfect options. Ser Reynold might be our best choice, Jon said slowly. He's a knight of some repute, originally from the Reach, but he's proven loyal to me these past weeks. There was a risk in sending an outsider, but perhaps the Serwins would appreciate a fresh perspective with no old grudges. He can bring 24 men, enough for a presence, not too many to weaken Winterfell's own guard. That might suffice, Maester Luwin said, relief in his voice. The main goal is to keep House Serwin from succumbing to fear. If they openly declare for the Boltons or even just remain neutral, our position grows more precarious. Jon acknowledged the point with a tight nod. Summon Ser Reynold. We'll send him by midday. The day passed in a flurry of preparations. Ser Reynold Faring arrived in the courtyard, a rangy man with streaks of gray in his hair, sporting a battered breastplate that bore no sigil. He had once been a hedge knight, or so rumor said, seeking service wherever he might find it. He knelt to Jon, repeating his oath to serve House Stark. Then he and his small band of mounted men rode out the gates, cloaks snapping in the chill wind. Jon stood on the ramparts, arms folded against the cold, Ghost at his side, watching them depart. Around him, the castle's walls loomed, old stone layered with winter's creeping frost. Once the riders were gone, a hush fell over the courtyard. Jon remained watchful, scanning the horizon, as if he might catch a glimpse of Bolton riders or the flicker of a Bolton banner. All he saw was white emptiness and the barest lines of distant tree groves. He resumed his duties, consulting with Maester Luwin about supply counts, sending more ravens to gather men, organizing extra training in the courtyard so that every swordsman and archer in Winterfell could face a potential siege. The men complained about numb fingers and stiff limbs, but they obeyed, mindful of the stories about Ramsay Bolton's cruelty. As the days marched on, a routine settled over Winterfell. Patrols ventured beyond the walls to check for signs of Bolton activity. Occasionally, they returned with news of small raids in outlying villages, or simply an eerie stillness. Lady Dustin took to riding out on her own, accompanied by half a dozen personal guards, as if she relished the idea of confronting Bolton's spies. She always returned with a smug air, though she reported nothing definitive. That uneasy quiet broke one snowy morning in the second week after Jon's return. A group of ragged peasants, escorted by a single guard wearing the Serwin sigil, stumbled through Winterfell's gates. Jon hurried down to the courtyard, where the guard knelt in a swirl of half-frozen mud. Ghosts sniffed around their legs, snorting at the scent of fresh blood from a wound on one man's arm. "My Lord Snow," the guard began shakily. "We come from Castle Serwin. There's ill news. Ser Reynold and the men you sent were ambushed by Bolton riders. They fought bravely but were overwhelmed. Ser Reynold is dead, my lord. The Bolton knights killed him and half his men." Jon felt a jolt in his chest. And House Serwin? Secured for now but frightened. The Boltons demanded they yield, threatening worse fates if they don't. "The regent begs you for immediate assistance. If you do not come, he fears the Serwin men will surrender, if only to avoid open slaughter." Jon's throat felt tight. Ser Reynold had been one of his few knights of some experience, and the death was a blow. More importantly, the Boltons had escalated their aggression, murdering a Stark envoy on Serwin land. That was a brazen move. Ramsay was testing how far he could go before Jon retaliated. He brought the guard to the Great Hall, where the man related more details to Lady Dustin, Maester Luwin, and a smattering of northern lords who had begun to gather. The ambush occurred on a narrow track south of Castle Serwin. Bolton riders emerged from the woods, outnumbering Ser Reynold's men at least 2-1. In the chaos, the Serwin escort managed to flee with a handful of peasants, determined to warn Winterfell. The rest had fallen under Bolton blades. When the tale was told, the hall fell silent. The fire popped and crackled, the only sound amid the hush. Jon stood, the edges of his anger creeping into his voice. "They slaughter our envoys, then threaten our bannermen. We cannot let this stand. If Serwin falls, Winterfell stands open for siege." Ricard Riswell, a grim man with a receding hairline, cleared his throat. "But can we risk sending more men away from Winterfell? We'll weaken ourselves if we march out. Might that be Bolton's plan, to draw us out so they can strike here?" Jon stared at the table, where a crudely drawn map of the local region lay unrolled. "If we do nothing, they take Serwin and march on us anyway. We have no choice but to respond." He looked up at the assembled faces. "I will lead the men this time. No more envoys. We march in force and send the Boltons a clear message that the seat of Stark will not be trifled with." Lady Dustin watched him with that faint, knowing smirk. "You realize that if you leave Winterfell, you risk the castle in your absence. Are you certain you can trust your allies here to defend it?" Jon's gaze flicked to her, measuring. "I trust the men who marched under me. Many are local, with families who have served House Stark for generations. They will defend Winterfell as if it's their own hearth." She arched a brow. "Very well. Then perhaps I should accompany you. My presence might sway certain lesser lords on the road. The Dustin name still carries weight among those who resent the Boltons." Jon hesitated. He did not fully trust Lady Dustin's motives, but her presence might indeed bring more men to their side. She had a knack for navigating the undercurrents of northern grudges. "If you will swear to support House Stark in this, I welcome your help." Her lips curved again. "I've already sworn to serve the rightful leadership of the North, haven't I? Besides, if the Boltons destroy Winterfell, Barrowton won't be far behind. I have my own reasons to see them chastened." It was settled. Over the next 2 days, messengers spread word of Jon's intent to gather a force at Winterfell and march to Serwin's aid. By the dawn of the third day, the courtyard teemed with men in fur-lined cloaks, stamping their feet to ward off the cold. Horses pawed at the frozen ground, while wagons rattled in with additional supplies. Jon donned his black leather armor, a fresh surcoat bearing the Stark direwolf, and a thick cloak. At his hip hung Longclaw, its pommel carved into a snarling wolf's head. He looked over the assembled ranks, perhaps 800 men in total. Some knights, many foot soldiers, a good number of archers. Not as many as he would have liked, but enough for a show of force. Lady Dustin rode up beside him on a tall mare, wearing a crimson cloak lined with sable, her face half hidden beneath a hood. Her retinue numbered close to 100, many wearing Dustin colors. They exchanged a glance, an unspoken accord. Once they rode out, there would be no turning back. Jon appointed a castellan to maintain Winterfell in his absence. An older man named Hallis Malin, who had served House Stark for years before following Robb, then returning due to an injury. Hallis bowed stiffly, accepting the responsibility with sober determination. "If the Boltons slip around you and attempt to siege us here, I'll hold them off as best I can," he said. "The walls stand strong, and the men's loyalty is unshakable." Jon clasped his hand. "That's all I ask. Keep them safe." And so they rode forth, the gates of Winterfell opening to disgorge a column of men and horses. A few onlookers remained behind, watching from the battlements. Snow flurries fell, catching in beards and hair, giving the day a ghostly pallor. Ghost bounded alongside Jon's horse, the dire wolf as silent and watchful as ever. Lady Dustin's men took up the rear, forming a rearguard. The wind carried their exhaled breath away in gray wisps. Their journey to Castle Serwin was relatively short. On a clear day without threat, one could make it in less than a half-day's ride from Winterfell. But with fresh snowfall and the constant fear of Bolton ambush, progress was slow. Scouts rode ahead to probe for trouble. Jon felt each moment weighed with tension, scanning the edges of the forest for any sign of an enemy presence. Once, they heard distant howls, and the men braced for confrontation, but nothing emerged except a few wary wolves hunting in the snowdrifts. When at last the towers of Castle Serwin came into view through the gray haze, the column halted briefly. Castle Serwin was not large, certainly no rival to Winterfell, but it stood on a rise overlooking farmland now buried under snow. Smoke curled from a few chimneys, a sign of life. Jon squinted, trying to see if any banners flew. At first, he saw only the familiar Serwin sigil, a black battle-axe on silver. But as they drew nearer, the watchers on the walls gave a shout, and the gates began to open. Men on the battlements peered anxiously down, crossbows and spears at the ready in case Jon's forces were hostile. Slowly, the Stark banners at the head of the column convinced them to stand down. A guard captain hurried out to greet Jon, relief evident in his features. "My Lord Snow," he said, bowing awkwardly. "We feared we'd be left to stand alone. Bolton riders lurk in the woods, testing our perimeter nightly." Jon dismounted, motioning for the men to follow. The courtyard of Castle Serwin was smaller than Winterfell's, with older, more worn stonework. The rank smell of uncleaned animal pens mingled with the biting cold. Several men in Serwin livery hovered about with uncertain eyes, as if they expected trouble to materialize at any moment. Lady Dustin rode in behind Jon, her cloak a startling red against the drab courtyard, and her expression one of keen assessment. Jon followed the guard captain into the main hall, where the regent, an elderly man named Edric Serwin, waited near a smoky hearth. He bent his head in greeting, his face lined with the burdens of sudden leadership and grief. The new young Lord Serwin, a boy of 7 or 8, clung to his hand, eyes wide. At the boy's side stood a small cluster of Serwin retainers, all appearing uneasy. "My lord," Edric Serwin said, voice trembling, "you have our gratitude for coming. Ser Reynolds' death shook us. The Boltons threaten daily. We feared you might not risk helping us." Jon offered a reassuring nod. "We are Starks of the North. We do not abandon our bannermen. I've brought men to strengthen your defenses, and together we'll drive off the Bolton threat if it comes to that." Edric Serwin slumped with relief. We hoped, but the Boltons have grown bold. They must believe the king in the north is too distracted in the south to respond. His gaze flicked to the boy. My nephew, Brandon Serwin, stands as lord now, after his father's murder. But he's just a child. My lord, we're at your mercy and counsel. Jon offered the boy a kind look. The king in the north is not absent. I speak for him while he battles the Lannisters. Your cause is our cause. Then Jon turned to Edric. Tell me all you know of Bolton movements. The regent motioned to a rough table in the corner, where a parchment map lay pinned by stones at each corner. He explained that roving bands of Bolton riders had approached from the northeast, testing the roads and farmsteads. One farm was burned, livestock stolen. The peasants living there were either slain or fled. The Bolton men sometimes left flayed bodies behind, a grotesque warning of what might happen if Castle Serwin resisted. The atrocities chilled Jon's blood. Ramsay's penchant for cruelty was well known, but hearing the details made his stomach twist. Lady Dustin's lips thinned. It's typical of them to employ fear. They want you to surrender without a pitched battle. Jon studied the map, noticing how close these raids came to the castle's walls. They're emboldened. Likely they expect no real response from Winterfell. He glanced over his shoulder at Edric Serwin. But now we're here in force. If we can find where these warbands are staging their attacks, we might send out a larger patrol to chase them away or destroy them outright. Edric Serwin nodded quickly. Our scouts suspect they shelter in a small wooded fort a few miles east. It's a half-ruined structure from the days of the old kings. But we haven't had the men to approach. Jon straightened, heart hammering with grim resolve. Then that's where we'll start. We'll take a contingent of knights and foot soldiers to flush them out. Lady Dustin, you'll remain here to oversee the general defense. She gave him a contemplative smile. You want me to hide behind these walls while you do the fighting? Jon shook his head. We need a commander in the castle if something goes awry. If I'm killed or if the Boltons slip past, you're second in command. We can't leave this seat leaderless. If that is unpalatable, we can discuss another arrangement, but the men will follow you if you speak with my authority. She studied him for a moment, head tilted, then inclined it in acceptance. Very well, I'll hold Castle Serwin, but see that you don't get yourself skewered trying to be a hero. The boy lord blinked at their exchange, clearly overwhelmed. Edric Serwin drew him away to a corner, quietly explaining the plan. Meanwhile, Jon conferred with his own captains, choosing how many men to send. They decided on a strike force of around 200, mostly cavalry and archers. The rest would remain to protect Serwin from any retaliation if the Boltons bypassed the ambush. The men readied themselves, checking saddles, sharpening blades, eating a quick meal. The next morning, Jon led the strike force out under a leaden sky. Ghost trotted at the head, nose sniffing the cold air. They skirted the farmland where the Bolton raids had taken place. The charred remains of a barn still visible, black timbers jutting up from snow like scorched bones. The men rode in somber silence, taking in the cruelty inflicted upon the small folk. Jon felt the same swirl of anger and sorrow as when he had first encountered Bolton atrocities near Winterfell. This was the shape of war in the north now. Not grand battles with shining banners, but vicious raids and silent terror. The wooded fort lay just as Edric Serwin's scouts had described. A low rise with a half-collapsed palisade, ringed by skeletal trees. The snow piled at the base of broken walls, but from a distance, one could see flickers of smoke that suggested campfires or torches inside. Jon halted his men out of sight. A scout returned, reporting that a good number of horses were corralled within, suggesting the presence of at least 50 to 60 Bolton riders, possibly more. Jon dismounted and motioned for his captains to huddle close. We'll divide into two parties, he said in a hushed tone. One on foot, circling around to the fort's rear, while the main force approaches from the front. Once they see the front assault, they'll likely try to flee out the rear. That's when we ambush them. The men nodded. Swords were drawn, bows unstrung from protective cases. The cold air stung their cheeks, but adrenaline warmed them. Jon could sense the tension. Many of these men had never fought the Boltons face to face, only heard tales of flayed corpses. A few prayed under their breath, calling on the old gods or the seven or whatever faith steadied their hearts. Ghost prowled near Jon, hackles raised, attuned to the excitement. With a terse gesture, Jon sent the foot soldiers under a seasoned sergeant around the fort's perimeter. They moved in near silence, disappearing into the trees. Then Jon led the rest forward, hooves crunching through the snow. When they were perhaps 100 yards from the palisade, a watchman on the fort's half-broken rampart spotted them and let out a shout. Immediately, several Boltons scrambled for their horses or for vantage points to loose arrows. Jon's front rank surged. Archers halted, knocked arrows and let fly. A volley of shafts arced through the air, peppering the old wooden walls. Screams erupted from inside. Bolton riders tried to mount up in a hurry, some returning fire with crossbows. One of Jon's men took a bolt through the shoulder, crying out and toppling from his saddle. Another arrow whistled past Jon's cheek, nearly grazing his hood. "Charge!" Jon roared, urging his horse to a gallop. The cavalry thundered across the open space, leaping over a broken trench that once ringed the palisade. The remains of a gate hung askew, just wide enough to navigate if they forced it. 2 or 3 Bolton men stood braced with spears, but they scattered as Jon's mounted knights bore down. Splintered wood flew as the men pounded through, into the fort's interior. It was a cramped, chaotic space, more a large courtyard than a true fort. The Boltons, clearly taken by surprise, scrambled to form any kind of defense. Horses whinnied and kicked, swords clanged on shields. Jon slashed one man across the arm, batting aside a desperate spear thrust. Ghost lunged at a crossbowman, tearing him down before he could reload. All around, men shouted and cursed, the swirl of melee thickening with the stench of blood. A group of Bolton riders succeeded in mounting and tried to ride out the back. That was when Jon's hidden foot soldiers emerged from the tree line, loosing arrows at the fleeing men. The Bolton riders reeled, some toppled from their saddles. Others swerved back inside only to run into the main force. Jon's men pressed them on every side, a net of steel. Soon it devolved into smaller pockets of fighting. Jon drove his horse toward one knot of Bolton men who had dismounted and formed a ragged circle. An arrow took one in the throat, dropping him. Another lunged forward with a shield to block Jon's slash, but Ghost sprang, sinking fangs into the man's calf. The Bolton soldier screamed, fell, and Jon's sword bit down, ending it. The snow churned underfoot, stained pink with blood. Exhilaration and horror mingled in Jon's heart. War was never clean, but the stark reality of so much death left him queasy even as he fought. The last few Boltons tried to retreat, but they found no opening. Some threw down their weapons, shouting pleas for mercy. Others fought to the bitter end, cornered near the collapsed palisade. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, but could only have been minutes, silence blanketed the fort, punctuated by the groans of the dying. Jon reined in his horse, breath ragged, scanning the chaos. Smoke drifted from overturned braziers. At least a dozen of Jon's men lay sprawled, dead or wounded. The Bolton casualties were higher by far, though that was small solace. He felt no triumph, only relief that they had at least curbed some of Ramsay's marauders. "Secure the prisoners," Jon ordered, dismounting with a wince at the tightness in his thighs. "See to our wounded. Round up the horses. We need to learn where Ramsay's main forces are." Men moved to obey. A handful of Bolton survivors, some with wounds, were dragged to a corner, forced to their knees, hands bound. Jon handed his reins off to an archer, then knelt beside a fallen soldier who wore the Stark direwolf sigil. The man gurgled, blood bubbled at his lips. Jon tried to do something, but the wound was mortal. He pressed a hand to the man's chest. "Easy," he murmured, though it was a futile comfort. The man's eyes went blank in moments. Jon swallowed hard, that familiar taste of sorrow rising in the back of his throat. He stood, wiping blood from his gauntlets, and turned to face the prisoners. One was a Bolton man with a face half covered in fresh cuts, his cloak torn. He glared at Jon with undiluted hatred. Another was younger, trembling, perhaps no older than 16. Yet another had a vacant, panicked look. Jon's men parted to let him stand before them. "Who commands you?" Jon demanded. Silence, broken only by a moan of pain from the youngest captive. "I asked who commands you. Roose Bolton or Ramsay Snow?" The older man spat blood. "We follow House Bolton, the true Warden of the North, not the bastard of Ned Stark." He let out a hacking laugh. "We only follow the rightful liege, not a caretaker pretender who kneels to a boy king in the south." Anger flared in Jon, but he kept his voice cold. "King in the north is no southern puppet, and you know it. Where is Ramsay? Does he lead you from the Dreadfort?" The prisoner remained stubbornly silent, though the younger one looked on the verge of speaking. Jon's gaze flicked to him. "You're hardly older than a squire. Speak, and you may keep your life." The boy swallowed. "Our Ramsay," he stammered. "He moves around. He doesn't stay at the Dreadfort long. Not with your men on the roads. We were told to harass and raid, to break the Serwins. Ramsay said the place would be ours by moon's turn." The older Bolto. Jon locked eyes with the boy. "Where is Ramsay now?" "I don't know," the boy whispered. "Truly, I don't. He sends orders by messenger. Last we heard, he was near the Overton Hills, rallying more men. Talk is that he means to cut off your supply lines if you come south from Winterfell." Another Bolton prisoner mustered enough courage to snarl. "Worthless whelp. Your flayed skin will decorate the Dreadfort's gates for this treachery." Ghost growled low in his throat. Jon felt a twinge of pity for the boy, a misguided youth caught up in Bolton cruelty. "Search the fort for anything useful," Jon said, turning away from the prisoners. "Maps, letters, or any supplies." While men began to scour the area, Jon had the prisoners separated. Those who refused to talk might face execution for the murder of Stark loyalists. The trembling boy, perhaps they could spare if he was willing to renounce Ramsay. War's cruelty left little room for benevolence, but some lines of mercy needed to remain, or else they would become as monstrous as the Boltons. It took some time to gather the horses, treat the wounded, and strip the dead of valuables. The men built a funeral pyre for their own fallen, gathering them gently. For the Bolton corpses, Jon reluctantly allowed them to be piled in a mass grave outside the fort walls. The ground was too frozen for easy digging, so it was a grim, shallow pit. A few of Jon's men asked if they might burn the Bolton dead as well, but in the north it was customary for House Stark to show at least some decency in burying enemies. Yet time and conditions were harsh, so the pit was all they could manage. As the sun dipped low, they established a defensive perimeter around the fort. Scouts reported no sign of another Bolton warband approaching, but no one wished to be caught unaware at dusk. Before night fell, they found a small store of stolen goods in the fort: grain sacks, salted meats, cloth apparently taken from Serwin villages. Among these items was a chest containing letters. The men who opened it found mainly scraps of parchment with crude messages, many referencing upcoming raids and instructions from a bee. It was not nearly enough to pinpoint Ramsay's location, but it confirmed that the Boltons had systematically planned these terror campaigns. Jon took a moment to breathe, leaning against a half-toppled section of wall. His limbs ached from the day's fighting and the cold. Ghost pressed against his leg, offering silent comfort. Flickering torches lit the interior of the fort, where men prepared to bed down for the night in relative safety. Far off, in the gloom, the faint cry of a wolf echoed across the snow-laden trees. One of Jon's captains, a man named Talon, approached quietly. "We should return to Castle Serwin by midday tomorrow," he said, glancing around. "We've done what we came for, I suppose. This warband is finished, but there could be others." Jon nodded. "We'll hold here until first light, then we'll head back. The Serwins need to see that we're actively protecting them. If more Bolton riders are out there, they'll think twice about tangling with us after today." Still, Jon could not shake the sense of how precarious their situation was. Ramsay was not cowed by one lost warband. If anything, he'd be enraged, possibly pushing him to bolder acts of brutality. They spent an uneasy night on alert, the bitter wind howling through the broken walls. Jon dozed fitfully, dreaming of a pack of white wolves racing across a battlefield of snow, howling at a red-flamed sky. He awoke at the first hint of dawn, chilled to his bones. Shaking off the nightmare, he mustered the men to leave as planned. They returned to Castle Serwin around midday. Lady Dustin greeted them at the gate, her expression one of scrutiny. She took in the losses, the wounded, and the handful of prisoners. "So it was a bloody affair," she remarked coolly. "Is that all of them?" Jon dismounted, wincing at the soreness in his thighs and shoulders. "Likely only one warband among many. Ramsay's no fool. He'll keep sending them to test us." She eyed the prisoners being led in shackles. "And these? We'll interrogate them further and decide their fate. Have your men remain vigilant. We'll need to rotate patrols around Serwin for at least the next fortnight." She nodded, then leaned in, lowering her voice. "The Boy Lord and his regent are clearly relieved by your success, but their worry remains. They wonder if you can truly guarantee their safety when Ramsay's threats persist." Jon glanced at the keep. He could imagine the Child Lord trembling behind stone walls, traumatized by his father's murder. "I can't promise there won't be more bloodshed, but I'll stand by them." He turned back to Lady Dustin, meeting her gaze. "What do you counsel?" She pursed her lips. "If you wish to preserve Serwin as a loyal seat, you might leave a garrison here. Enough men to give the Boltons pause. Then you return to Winterfell, gather more forces if you can. The path to the Dreadfort might be blocked by winter snows soon, but Ramsay could still harass the roads until then." Jon saw the logic, yet that stretched their numbers even thinner. "We have to do something," he muttered half to himself. "If the Boltons keep picking off small seats, they'll isolate Winterfell eventually." Lady Dustin's eyes were shrewd. "If you had the men to mount a direct campaign against the Dreadfort, you could break them. But do you? And do you dare, when you must keep watch over Winterfell?" Jon's throat tightened. "Not yet. Perhaps once word spreads that we crushed this warband, more houses will rally. But the deeper winter sets in, the harder it will be to move an army across the north." She shrugged. "That might be what Bolton counts on, that you'll be forced to hunker down, letting him maintain terror throughout the region. Once the first heavy snows fall, any large-scale march becomes near impossible." The frustration weighed heavily on Jon. He felt pinned between responsibilities. Uphold Robb's authority, protect Winterfell, shield the smaller houses. The old Ned Stark sense of honor demanded he help them all. But men and resources were finite, especially after so many had marched south with Robb. They retreated to the Great Hall, where Edric Serwin gathered to hear of the victory. The Boy Lord clung to the regent's robes, but perked up at the news that Bolton raiders had been scattered. Still, the relief was tempered by the knowledge that more might come. Jon assured them that a garrison of 80 men would remain for the next several weeks, with instructions to guard the roads and coordinate any further defenses. Lady Dustin agreed to leave 10 of her riders as well, a gesture that seemed more about ensuring her involvement than about genuine altruism, but Jon welcomed it all the same. For another day, Jon lingered at Castle Serwin, trying to fortify morale and arrange a chain of communication with Winterfell. Maester Luwin had sent a younger aide in his place, a man named Palthor, who'd remain at Serwin to handle ravens and keep in touch. By the time Jon finally prepared to depart, the Serwin regent openly thanked him, going as far as to call him Lord Snow of Winterfell. Jon corrected him, clarifying that Robb was the rightful lord, but the old man seemed to prefer the immediate presence of Jon to a distant king. When morning came, Jon's reduced column set off back toward Winterfell. His mood was as gray as the sky, thinking of how the Bolton threat stretched across the north, intangible and persistent. They had secured Castle Serwin for now, but it felt like a temporary reprieve. In war, momentum could shift quickly, especially when an enemy relied on terror and cunning more than open battle. They traveled with care, though they encountered no Bolton forces on the road. One evening, They sheltered in the burned ruins of a small holdfast. Another day of travel brought them within a few miles of Winterfell. Snow fell steadily, the wind rising in a moan that echoed through barren trees. At last, the familiar walls and towers emerged from the swirling drifts, and the men gave weary sighs of relief. Jon found Winterfell calmer than he expected. Hallis Malin and the garrison had faced no assaults, though tensions simmered. Some travelers from the west had arrived, speaking of ironborn ships prowling the coastline near Torrens Square. Others whispered of more murders in random villages. Worse, supplies were beginning to strain with so many extra mouths to feed in the castle. The granaries were adequate, but if the winter proved long and harsh, they could face shortages. After stabling his horse, Jon went straight to the Great Hall, removing his gloves and stamping off snow. He was greeted by the sight of a letter from King Robb, delivered that morning. The parchment was sealed with the direwolf crest, a bit battered from the journey. Jon's heart thudded as he cracked the seal and unfolded it. In the flickering firelight, he read, "Jon, we have taken a blow at Riverrun. The Lannisters have captured my uncle Edmure Tully. The castle still holds, but it stands on the brink. My forces are divided, and I can ill afford to send men north at this juncture. I have learned that the Boltons grow bold. I command you to hold them at bay. Destroy them if you must. I cannot allow the North to be wrested from Stark control while I war against the Iron Throne. If you need additional authority to summon the North's remaining strength, you have it. Word will be sent to all northern houses, instructing them to obey you in my stead until this war is won. But I can send no more men from my host. You must find a way or hold out until I can return. Robb Stark, King in the North." Jon read it twice, a swirl of conflicting emotions flaring. So Robb was in dire straits, pinned between the Lannisters at Riverrun and the Ironborn in the west. He was giving Jon full authority in the north, an undeniable sign of trust, yet offering no tangible reinforcements. The north was on its own. Jon realized he would have to be more decisive, more ruthless perhaps, if he was to stamp out Bolton influence before the deeper winter arrived. He stood there by the fire for a long moment, the letter crinkling in his hands. Lady Dustin stepped in from the shadows, her gaze flicking to the parchment. "More dire tidings from the south, I presume?" Jon glanced at her. "Robb's command is clear. We're to handle the Boltons ourselves, with no support from his host." A thin smile crossed her lips. "Then you truly are the caretaker of the North. In practice, if not in name." He folded the letter and tucked it away. "We need to press the other lords. Send out calls to muster. If we can field an army large enough, we can march on the Dreadfort. If we end this threat at its source, the North can settle." Lady Dustin's eyes glinted. "A bold plan, but do you think you can muster enough men to besiege the Dreadfort? Especially with winter looming?" Jon's hand clenched. "We have no other choice. If we wait for spring, Ramsay will consolidate his hold, and by then the damage done to these villages and lesser houses will be unimaginable. We have to try. We have the king's authority. Any house that refuses to answer will be named a traitor." She inclined her head, lips curving in a small smirk. "Harsh times call for harsh measures, don't they? Very well, I will send my own ravens. The question is, will enough lords risk their men when winter approaches?" Jon knew many in the north would be reluctant. Harvest was poor this year, and the thought of campaigning in snow-choked roads was daunting. But perhaps fear of Bolton cruelty would outweigh that. Or perhaps loyalty to the Starks still lived strong enough to spur them on. "We'll see soon," he said quietly. "If they do not come, the Boltons will pick them off one by one." That night, Jon convened a war council in the smaller solar near the library. Lady Dustin attended, along with Maester Luwin, Rickard Riswell, a representative from House Glover who had arrived that week, and several other mid-ranking lords or knights. The great hall was too large and drafty for a comfortable council, so they gathered around a single table heaped with maps and candles. Ghost lay near the hearth, unblinking eyes watching them all. Jon stood at the head of the table, voice low but firm. We have King Robb's explicit authority to deal with the Boltons. The time for half measures is gone. We must call the banners still in the north, houses not fully depleted by the Southern War. We know House Manderly is strong at White Harbor. House Glover might muster more men at Deepwood Motte if the roads remain passable. The mountain clans can field hardy warriors who are unafraid of snow. If we unite them, we can outnumber the Boltons. Ricard Riswell frowned. Manderly might not send many, worried about sea raids. Glover is recovering from Ironborn attacks. The mountain clans, well, they're scattered and prideful. You'd have to request them in person. They might not respond well to a raven's words. John pursed his lips. We might have to do exactly that. Lady Dustin, would you ride south to White Harbor? You have some standing there, I believe. They trade with Barrowton. She cocked her head, considering. I could, yes, though I'd expect to find a fractious nest. Lord Wyman Manderly has always danced a delicate line between Stark loyalty and the opportunities provided by Southern trade. He might not want to commit to a winter campaign, but I'll try. John nodded. Good. Glover is likely to respond if we can demonstrate we're serious. We can send a second envoy there. As for the mountain clans, I may need to ride to them myself or dispatch a trusted commander. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated at how many tasks needed doing. We're pressed for time. If we delay too long, the roads will be truly impassable. They spent hours hammering out a plan, scribbling letters, deciding which ravens flew where. By the time they concluded, the candles had burned low, dripping wax onto the wooden table in pale rivulets, and the sky outside was black. Everyone looked exhausted, though perhaps a bit more resolute. War pressed them from every angle, and only by forging a unified front could they hope to succeed. As the meeting broke up, John caught Maester Luwin's arm. I'd like to have a word. The Maester nodded, following John into a quieter corner of the solar. Ghost trailed behind. What is it, my lord? John paused, expression grim. I know you've heard the rumors about my parentage, my Targaryen blood. Some men might see that as a reason to distrust me, or they might hope to use it somehow. I fear that if the Boltons learn of that rumor, or if it spreads further, it could undermine the Stark cause. Luwin nodded gravely. Rumors have a way of finding life in troubled times. I know of no proof that you are Rhaegar Targaryen's son, though Ned Stark's reticence on your mother remains notable. Regardless, for many you are Ned's son. That is enough. But if men think you might claim more than the North, if they fear you might cast your ambitions beyond. John cut him off, voice firm. I have no interest in claiming anything beyond the North. I bent the knee to Robb. That must be clear. But I don't want this rumor to fracture our unity right when we need it most. Luwin bowed his head. I will do what I can to quell such talk, but you know how whispers spread. In the end, your actions must speak louder. Prove your loyalty to the North, and fewer will question you. John exhaled. Then I'll keep doing so, no matter the cost. The days that followed were a flurry of urgent activity. Ravens were dispatched in all directions, their small black forms cutting across a sky thick with clouds. Lady Dustin departed with a retinue, bound for White Harbor. Ricard Riswell left for the mountain clans to the northwest, taking a small escort and armed with a letter sealed by John. Maester Luwin worked tirelessly, transcribing letter after letter, reinforcing that John spoke with the king's own authority. Any house failing to answer could be labeled traitor. That language was harsh, but necessary, and it pricked John's conscience. He remembered his father's lessons. One must rule with both justice and mercy, yet war demanded an edge of steel that mercy alone could not provide. Winterfell's training yard bustled. John ordered daily drills for archers and foot soldiers. They practiced forming shield walls in the snow, firing volleys of arrows into straw targets shaped like flayed men. Swords clashed in the crisp air, the ring of steel echoing off stone walls. The men grumbled, but the discipline took hold. Ghost stalked the yard, a silent, pale presence that spurred them to focus. Many had seen Ghost in battle, tearing out the throats of Bolton men. They did not wish to disappoint the direwolf's master. Occasionally, refugees trickled in, peasants from outlying farms who feared more raids. Jon gave them shelter in Winterfell's outbuildings or stables, rationing food carefully. Every day, the threat of shortage loomed larger, yet he could not turn them away. Nor could he fail to notice the increasing pressure on Winterfell stores. If no relief came before the heavy snows, they might all starve. Amid this flurry, news arrived in small fragments. Some houses responded quickly, pledging men or supplies. The Glovers wrote that they would send a token force, as they were still rebuilding after the Ironborn siege, but they remained loyal. The Karstarks, scattered though they were, promised a few hundred under a cousin's leadership. Other houses, smaller or more distant, delayed their replies. House Manderly's response had yet to come. Jon found each day passing in a swirl of duties, yet actual progress felt glacial. Then, after a fortnight, as the snow fell in earnest, a raven arrived from White Harbor. Lady Dustin's personal seal glistened upon the parchment. Jon tore it open in the library tower, the fireplace crackling behind him, Ghost dozing at his feet. "My Lord Snow, I have spoken at length with Lord Wyman Manderly. He is, well, as one might expect, cautious. He will not commit all his men to a siege of the Dreadfort, but he is willing to send a significant number if you can prove that other major houses will stand with you. He demands assurances of supply lines, lest his men starve on the march. I am pressing him for more. He has also expressed interest in what your long-term intentions might be, though I suspect that is a polite inquiry into rumors. I have assured him you are loyal to Robb, not some Targaryen pretender. For now, I remain here hoping to finalize an agreement. If we succeed, the Manderlys could offer a few thousand men, no small sum. Hold the line in Winterfell. If the Boltons advance before these negotiations conclude, you may need to act without White Harbor's help. B. Dustin." Jon set the letter down, a mixture of relief and frustration in his gut. Thousands of men from White Harbor might be enough to mount a campaign against the Dreadfort, but only if Lord Manderly could be convinced. Time was not on their side. The earliest heavy snowfalls had begun, blanketing the roads. Another few weeks, and armies might be forced to remain where they were until spring. He relayed the letter's contents to Maester Luwin and Hallis Malin. They decided to send another plea to Manderly, promising to help with supply lines as best as possible. They would urge Rickard Ryswell to do the same with the mountain clans, hopefully coordinating a push from multiple directions. Still, days passed without new information. Each morning, Jon rose early, patrolled the yard, met with stewards, and tried to keep morale from sinking. Each night, he paced the halls of Winterfell, warring with the knowledge that the Boltons might be out there, growing stronger. They had not launched another direct raid since the destruction of that warband in the ruined fort, but the silence felt ominous. One evening, after an exhausting round of training sessions, Jon found himself in the crypts beneath Winterfell. He carried a small lantern that cast dancing shadows on the stone steps. Ghost walked with him, nails clicking. The chilly air seemed to whisper with the voices of the dead. He passed the statues of old Stark kings, each clutching a sword across his lap, direwolf at his feet. It was a place of reverence and memory, but also of ghosts from the past, literally and figuratively. He paused before the statue of Ned Stark. The likeness was not perfect, but it was close enough to stir an ache in Jon's heart. The lantern's glow revealed stone eyes, solemn and unyielding. Jon set the lantern down on the cold floor, his breath visible in the dimness. "Father," he murmured, voice echoing faintly. "I don't know what to do. Robb is at war, trusting me to guard the north. The Boltons press on every side. I never wanted to claim your seat, but I had no choice. I promised I'd yield it when Robb returned, but if he can't come back..." He swallowed, the weight of that possibility settling. "He may be pinned by Lannisters and Ironborn, or even killed. Then what? How do I lead a fractured north?" The statue gave no answer, of course. But Jon felt the unspoken lesson of his father's life. Do your duty, even if it kills you. He closed his eyes briefly, imagining the warmth of Ned Stark's hand on his shoulder. "I won't fail the North," he murmured. "Nor Robb. I swear it." He turned to go, mind heavy, but as he did, Ghost let out a soft growl. Jon tensed, scanning the darkness for any sign of danger. The crypts were empty save for the silent dead. Yet Ghost's hackles were raised. Perhaps it was just the direwolf's sensitivity to the eerie atmosphere. Still, it set Jon's nerves on edge. He left quickly, climbing the steps back to Winterfell's courtyard, passing a guard who gave him a curious look. Jon said nothing, only nodded and strode on. The next morning, a biting cold snap froze the slush in the yard, turning footprints into solid ridges. Men trudged around with stiff limbs, breath billowing. In the great hall, a thin crowd of soldiers and servants broke their fast on porridge and hard bread. Jon accepted a bowl, though he barely tasted it. His mind churned on the problem of how to force the Boltons into a decisive confrontation. Halfway through his meal, another raven arrived, this one from the Ryswell party. Rickard Ryswell's short letter explained that the mountain clans agreed in principle to lend men, but only if Jon personally journeyed to their high passes to confirm alliances. They did not trust a mere letter or an emissary. They wanted to speak to the man who claimed to represent the Starks. Jon let out a frustrated hiss. Travel to the mountain passes in the deep of winter was risky, and time was short. But the clans could add another 500 or 600 hardy warriors, no small number. That evening, Jon called another meeting with his captains. Many frowned at the idea of him leaving Winterfell. Hallis Malin expressed concern. "If you're gone, who holds the seat? Lady Dustin is absent. Rickard Ryswell is absent. We risk a leadership void." Jon rubbed his temple. "A short trip. I take a small escort, move swiftly. We can push through the passes before the worst snows if we leave soon." "And if the Boltons attack while you're away?" someone asked. Jon braced himself. "We have enough men here to hold the walls. I'd only be gone a week, 2 at most. The payoff could be substantial." The men exchanged uneasy glances, but no one had a better suggestion. So it was decided that Jon would travel west to meet the mountain clan chiefs, accompanied by a small band. Hallis Malin would serve as castellan again, with the assistance of Maester Luwin for counsel. They prayed the Boltons would remain quiet for that span. Preparations went quickly. Jon packed warm furs, enough provisions for a 2-week journey, and carefully selected an escort of about 30 men, most of them skilled riders and archers. He left instructions for the continuing muster, telling the houses that once their men arrived, they should remain at Winterfell or Castle Serwin until Jon returned. Every hour he wondered if this was folly, but the dream of a united North spurred him on. At dawn, they set forth once more from Winterfell's gates. Ghost padded alongside, seemingly unbothered by the cold. The men carried torches that sputtered in the wind, though the early light began to brighten the sky as they rode westward. Snow crunched under the horses' hooves. The plan was to skirt the King's Road for a short distance, then turn north into the foothills that led to the high passes where the mountain clans dwelled. The first day passed without incident, though the wind grew fiercer. They paused for the night at a modest inn near a crossroad. The inn was nearly empty, the proprietor a gaunt woman who eyed them warily. She had heard stories of Bolton raids and was mistrustful of any armed party. But once Jon and his men displayed the Stark sigil, she relaxed enough to serve them a thin stew. Jon paid with silver stags from the chest of supplies set aside for such journeys. That night, the men slept uneasily on straw pallets, swords at their sides. On the second day, the weather worsened. A flurry turned into a near blizzard, lashing them with biting snow. Progress slowed to a crawl, and soon they found themselves trudging through drifts that rose to the horses' hocks. The men muttered darkly about the risk of being trapped. Jon pressed them on. If they delayed, the mountain passes might close entirely. By midday, their faces were stung red, cloaks coated in a layer of frost. Finally, they spotted a small holdfast nestled at the foot of the hills, a refuge from the storm. They pounded on the gates, identifying themselves as Stark men, and after some hesitation, the local steward let them in. The holdfast was little more than a wooden palisade and a few huts, but it offered a stable for the horses and a smoky hall for warmth. The steward, a wiry older man, brought out a pot of boiled turnips and onions. It was not much, but the men devoured it gratefully. Jon asked if the holdfast had seen any Bolton riders. The steward nodded grimly. A half-dozen passed by a few days back, brandishing flayed man banners. They demanded to search for Stark allies, but we told them we had none. They rode off soon after. Didn't kill any of us, though they threatened it. Jon exchanged a dark look with his men. Even in these remote foothills, the Boltons spread their net. He quietly assured the steward that the king in the north was dealing with them, and that Jon Snow, caretaker of Winterfell, was forging a united front. The steward seemed skeptical. They come with swords and cruel intentions. Words alone won't chase them, he muttered. After an uneasy night, Jon's group departed early, determined to reach the mountain clan territory by midday. The snow had abated somewhat, leaving a thick blanket over the world. The landscape was strangely beautiful. Pines weighed down with white, rocky outcroppings peeking through the drifts. The men had to lead their horses at times, picking a path through precarious slopes. Every so often, Ghost stopped and sniffed the air, as if expecting danger. Close to noon, they encountered the first of the mountain clan scouts, a lean man in patched furs, an axe at his belt, appearing from behind a boulder. He raised a hand, calling out a challenge. Jon stepped forward and declared who he was. The scout eyed them with suspicion, then motioned for them to follow. Up a winding path they went, deeper into the hills, until at last they arrived at a small plateau where about 20 clan warriors waited. Rickard Ryswell stood among them, looking relieved at Jon's arrival. "You made it," he said, clasping Jon's hand. "I worried you'd be buried in the snow." "It was close," Jon replied wryly, "but we're here. How goes your negotiations?" Ryswell gestured to a bearded man in thick fur, a large sword strapped across his broad back. "This is Gorn Farrell, one of the clan chiefs. We've been in talks for days. He wants to see you. They hold a council at a cave beyond the ridge, where the other chiefs have gathered." Jon nodded, stepping forward to greet Gorn. The man's gaze was sharp, taking Jon's measure. "So you're the one they call Snow," he said, voice like a low rumble. "Bastard of Ned Stark, caretaker of Winterfell. You want us to fight for you, is that it?" Jon met his eyes without flinching. "I do. The Boltons threaten the north, terrorizing small folk and seats alike. Robb Stark, the king in the north, battles the Lannisters. We must handle the Boltons ourselves. We ask for the clan's help to overthrow them." Gorn Farrell snorted. "We remember the Boltons from old times, flayed skins and savage ways. But the clans seldom get involved in the squabbles of lowlanders. We prefer to guard our passes. Why should we commit men to your war?" Jon steadied himself. He thought of Ned Stark's lessons in how to treat proud mountain men. They respected directness, not flowery southern talk. "Because the Boltons won't stop at the lowlands," he said plainly. "If they gain power, they'll come for you. They'll tax your trade routes, or worse, attempt to subdue you. You'll face them alone if you don't stand with us." Gorn's eyes narrowed. "We can hide in our mountains, pick off intruders like wolves with a wounded deer." Jon nodded. "That might work for a time, but you'd be cut off from trade, from supplies you need. Winter is here. If the Boltons isolate you, how long will your clans last? Better to face them on our terms, with all the north behind us, than to fight alone when they decide you're worth subduing." A tense silence followed. Gorn stared at Jon, then shifted his attention to Rickard Ryswell, who nodded in agreement. Finally, Gorn gave a curt nod. "Perhaps you have a point. Come." The other chiefs wait in council. They'll decide. Jon and his men followed Gorn's group through a winding path that led to a natural cave entrance. Smoke drifted out, the scent of cooking meat. Inside, a fire burned in a wide chamber, illuminating stalactites overhead. 5 or 6 men and women, presumably chiefs or elders, sat on flat rocks, passing around skins of drink. They looked up as Jon entered, multiple pairs of sharp eyes assessing the new arrival. Gorn introduced Jon, stating his presence plainly. He's come to beg alliance against the Boltons. A man with a braided beard spat near the fire, as if unimpressed. Jon took a step forward, meeting their stares. I am Jon Snow, sent by King Robb Stark. Many of you might remember Ned Stark's sense of honor, how he never pressed unfair taxes on the clans. I have no desire to see you subjugated by the Boltons, but we need your help, your warriors, to ensure the Boltons don't overrun the north. If you join us, I pledge the Starks will remember your loyalty and treat you fairly in the days to come. An older woman, her hair white as the snow, spoke. The mountain clans have spilt blood for the Starks in ages past, only to be forgotten when the winter ended. What guarantee do we have that this time is different? Jon exhaled. I cannot promise everything, but I swear by my father's memory and by the old gods that if you fight with us, the king in the north will not forget. You'll have free access to the lowlands for trade, no extra tariffs, and the Boltons will never darken your passes with their terror. Some of the chiefs exchanged glances. Gorn Farrell chimed in. We've been discussing this for days. The Boltons have grown bold, but they've not yet come for us. Still, we see which way the wind blows. Perhaps it's best to stand with the wolves, not the flayed men. He looked around at the others. I say we commit a portion of our warriors. Not all. Some must remain to defend our villages, but enough to prove our sincerity. One of the other men, with a scar running down his left cheek, grunted. Aye, that might be wise. Better to fight them on southern ground than let them come creeping into our hills. The braided beard man snorted. We're putting our necks on the line for a bastard's war. But if the rest of you are for it, I'll not stand in the way. The white-haired woman nodded, though her eyes were grave. Then it's decided. We will muster 300 warriors from the surrounding clans. Each clan can spare some. They will gather near the old standing stones in 3 days' time. From there, they'll march under your banner, provided you treat them well and keep them fed. Jon suppressed a sigh of relief. 300 might not sound like a huge number, but these were hardy fighters, skilled in mountain survival. They'd be worth double that in harsh conditions. I'll see that we get you additional supplies once we reach Winterfell, Jon said. I thank you for your trust, and the king in the north thanks you as well. With that, the council rose. Ricard Riswell clasped Jon's shoulder, murmuring, Well done. They've been stubborn. Your presence helped. Jon nodded, grateful. The clan chiefs began to file out of the cave, calling to their attendants to spread the word. Gorn motioned for Jon to follow. I'll show you where you can rest tonight. We have a hunting lodge nearby, only slightly drafty. Tomorrow we feast to seal the pact. Jon was about to reply when Ghost let out a low growl at the cave entrance. The men turned, hands going to weapons. A single messenger from the mountain clans, panting heavily, appeared at the threshold of the firelight. The man's face was pale, eyes wide. Chief Gorn, he gasped. We found a body on the trail, one of your scouts. He'd been flayed. Tension rippled through the chamber. The mention of flaying sent an immediate chill. Jon's fists clenched. Gorn's gaze snapped to Jon. The Boltons are near? The messenger nodded rapidly. We tracked footprints, perhaps a dozen men. They might be heading closer, but the storm covered their trail. We can't be sure. A hush fell. Gorn's face twisted with anger. They dare come into our hills, kill my scout, and flay him like a trophy? Ricard Riswell's eyes flashed. They must be searching for us or trying to sabotage any alliance with the clans. If they realize Jon Snow is here, they might attempt something bolder. Jon's pulse quickened. We need to track them. If we let them slip away, they'll kill more scouts, or at least warn Ramsay that the clans are joining us. Gorn bared his teeth in a snarl. Yes, we'll hunt them down. Tonight. The council erupted in a flurry of movement. Chiefs barked orders to their men, calling them to arms. Torches were thrust into waiting hands. Ricard Riswell signaled for Jon's escort to gather. All thoughts of rest vanished. Jon steeled himself for the possibility of another skirmish in the snowy dark. The Boltons had come dangerously close, an audacious move that signaled their cunning. They knew that forging alliances would be the downfall of their terror strategy, and so they struck early, trying to scare the clans into staying neutral. Night in the mountains was unforgiving, the cold so sharp it felt like knives on exposed skin. The war party, about 50 strong, with Gorn Farl in the lead, set out from the cave. Bundled in heavy furs, carrying torches that flickered in the wind, they moved in near silence. Ghost ranged ahead with a few clan scouts, using his keen nose to detect any sign of the enemy. The ground was treacherous, full of hidden stones and sudden drop-offs. More than once, a man stumbled, cursing softly as he righted himself. They found the dead scout's body after about a mile, a gruesome spectacle. The poor soul had been pinned to a tree, the chest flayed open in the manner so favored by House Bolton. The snow around the base of the trunk was dark with frozen blood. Several of the clan warriors swore vengeance on the spot, while others averted their eyes. Jon's stomach churned at the cruelty. He silently vowed that the Boltons would answer for every life they tormented. Ghost sniffed around the area, letting out a whine. Jon knelt by the body, swallowing back bile. "We must burn him," he said quietly. "It's the least we can do." Gorn nodded, teeth clenched. We will. But first, we find the ones who did this." The tracks in the snow were partially covered by drifts, but the scouts picked up enough to follow. They moved deeper into the pines, occasionally pausing to listen for any sign of movement. The wind made it hard to hear, howling through the branches. Jon couldn't help but feel they were walking into a trap. The Boltons might be luring them away from the main group, or perhaps they were only a small band operating on their own. At last, the scouts signaled. They had spotted a flicker of firelight in a hollow below the ridge. The war party halted, torches doused, forging on in darkness. The moon was obscured by clouds, leaving the world a palette of gray and black. Carefully, they crept to the edge of a rocky outcropping overlooking the hollow. Below, half hidden by pines, flickered the faint glow of a campfire. Silhouettes moved around it. Jon's heart quickened. A group of about a dozen men, likely the Bolton raiders, huddled around the fire, no doubt confident that no one would find them in this wilderness. Gorn motioned for the clan warriors to fan out and surround the hollow. Jon nodded, beckoning Rickard Riswell and a few of his men to follow. Ghost slipped through the snow like a silent wraith, disappearing down the slope. They crept as close as they dared, hearing the low murmur of voices. The vantage was not perfect in the darkness, but the men below wore cloaks that seemed dark or possibly red, the color hard to discern by firelight, but the presence of flayed man sigils was certain enough. Jon raised his hand, signaled a silent count of 3. On the third gesture, Gorn let out a piercing whistle, and the clan warriors sprang from multiple angles. Jon and Rickard's men joined, descending into the hollow. Surprise was total. Several Boltons lurched up, grabbing for their weapons, but it was too late. Arrows hissed through the air, and men toppled with cries of pain. Ghost charged, knocking a stunned soldier back into the fire. Another tried to run, only to be tackled by a clan warrior's throwing axe. Snow flew in a frenzy of movement, men colliding, swords slashing. Jon found himself face to face with a tall Bolton rider who swung a mace at his head. Jon ducked, feeling the rush of air as the spiked ball whooshed past. He countered with a thrust of long claw, catching the man in the side. A groan, and the Bolton sank into the snow, blood darkening the whiteness. Another raider rushed Jon from behind, but Rickard Riswell intercepted with a savage hack of his sword. Jon nodded in thanks, stepping over the bodies. Within moments, the skirmish was decided. Some of the Boltons tried to surrender, others died fighting. One or two might have fled into the darkness, but if so, the clan scouts would chase them. Gorn Farl found the one who bore the flaying knife, likely the man who had mutilated the scout. He showed no mercy, running him through with a guttural cry of anger. The hollow fell silent once more, aside from the crackle of the... Jon looked around, chest heaving. The entire encounter had taken less than a minute. "Is that all of them?" he asked, voice hushed. One of the clan scouts nodded, though he said a pair might have escaped. Gorn spat on the snow. "They'll not get far in this darkness. We'll track them. But these will kill right here, or do you wish to take them prisoner?" Jon stared at the captives on their knees, two men trembling, hands raised in a plea for mercy. In the swirl of adrenaline, it was tempting to end them as swiftly as they'd ended the scout. But a pang of conscience nagged him. "We'll take them back," he said finally. "They might have information on Ramsay's whereabouts. No need to stoop to flaying or summary execution." He shot Gorn a look. "We are not the Boltons." The clan chief grunted, seeming half resigned, half amused. "Very well, you question them. But if they lie, you can deliver their heads to me." Jon nodded. They spent the next hour tending their wounded, luckily few, then hurried back to the original site of the flayed scout. They burned the poor man's body with a solemn oath that vengeance had been taken. A hush lay over the mountains as they retreated to the cave. Dawn was only a few hours away, but nobody felt much like sleeping. They fed the fires, tied up the captives, and waited for morning in tense exhaustion. When the sun finally rose, it glinted off the snowy peaks, painting them pale gold. Inside the cave, Gorn's clan prepared a simple meal of boiled meat. Jon, huddled near the fire, stared at the bound Bolton men. One of them was older, with a grizzled beard, the other younger, face bruised. Under threat of clan axes, they had little choice but to answer Jon's questions. As expected, they were merely part of a roving group, scouring the hills for signs of Stark messengers. They knew Ramsay wanted to disrupt any alliances. They had no precise knowledge of his main location. "He roams," the older captive muttered, "takes a handful of men, terrorizes a region, then moves on." Gorn Farrell paced around them, itching for vengeance. "We have your word that these scum are valuable to you, Snow?" he asked with a sneer. Jon glanced at the prisoners. "They've told us what they know. There's little more to learn. If you want your justice, I won't stand in your way." He had tried to maintain some measure of Stark mercy, but if the men had no further information and were guilty of flaying, perhaps he owed them no quarter. The older captive's eyes went wide, and he began babbling pleas. Jon cut him off. "You murdered innocents, tortured them. There's no place for that in the north. Not under the Starks, not under the mountain clans. You reaped what you sowed." He stepped aside, gesturing to Gorn. The clan chief wasted no time. He gave the two men a chance to pray or beg, but they only sputtered. With a single swing of his sword, he ended both. Jon forced himself to watch, to remember that the Boltons had brought this on themselves. Ghost stood nearby, silent, expression inscrutable. That grim morning sealed the alliance. The clan chiefs, seeing the cruelty of the Boltons firsthand, pledged their 300 warriors wholeheartedly. They promised to gather within a week, then march to Winterfell under Jon's banner. Jon thanked them and assured them of the king in the North's gratitude. With that, they parted ways. Jon and Rickard Ryswell led their party back out of the mountains, hearts heavy with the memory of that flayed scout. They left behind Gorn's men preparing for war, forging fresh steel arrowheads and gathering winter provisions. The descent was as treacherous as the ascent, but the weather was slightly kinder. When they finally reached the foothills, a clan guide bid them farewell. On the third day of their return journey, while camping near a frozen creek, they found a messenger from Winterfell waiting, one of Jon's own scouts, half frozen but determined. The scout brought urgent news. A large Bolton force had been sighted east of Winterfell, near the fork in the White Knife River. They were rumored to be marching in strength, possibly preparing to cut off the eastern approach. Jon read the brief message by the light of a small fire, the wind howling around them. The words made his blood run cold. So Ramsay was finally mustering a larger host, or perhaps Roose had broken from Robb in the south to assist his bastard. If the Boltons controlled the eastern approach, they could block any reinforcements from White Harbor. Winterfell might be caught in a vice. He turned to Rickard Ryswell and the small group around the fire. "We need to get back with all haste. The real fight is about to begin. They stamped out the fire and mounted up in the darkness, pushing through the snowy tracks. Each day that passed, the roads grew more perilous, and each day they delayed, the Boltons advanced. Jon felt the urgency in every breath, as if the North itself were warning him. Time is running out. The final confrontation with the flayed men was at hand, and the fate of Winterfell, the North, and possibly the entire Stark cause lay in the balance.